Committee will come to order. Chair notes the presence of a quorum. The committee meets today to consider and mark up H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. For 55 straight years, under Congresses and presidents of both parties, an annual NDAA has been signed into law. I'm certain that this year will be no different. The members of this committee have an overwhelming commitment to the duty placed on us by the Constitution to support the men and women who serve our nation in the military. Every member of this committee has contributed to this legislation. Committee members suggested 1,531 separate legislative provisions for consideration in the marks. Over 330 amendments were filed for today. But members also contributed by asking thoughtful questions at our briefings and hearings, by traveling to visit our troops at home and overseas, by sharing their personal experiences and insights, and by talking with one another about how to solve problems. And so first, I want to express my appreciation to each of the members and to our staffs for your work so far in developing this year's NDAA. This is a team effort, and I think it's safe to say there's nothing else like it these days in Congress. And I want to especially express appreciation to the ranking member because his spirit of working together, even when and especially when we have different views, keeping in mind the security of the nation is something that also is not common in Congress, but essential if we are to fulfill our duties. We began our hearings this year looking at the state of the world and the nature of the threats we face. We went on to examine the state of our military after years of continuing resolutions in the Budget Control Act. What we heard was alarming, and that was also reflected in Secretary Mattis's testimony before us on June 12th. I was struck by this paragraph of his testimony, quote, "4 years later, I returned to the department and I have been shocked by what I've seen with our readiness to fight. For all the heartache caused by the loss of our troops during these wars, no enemy in the field has done more harm to the readiness of our military than sequestration. We have only sustained our ability to meet America's commitments abroad because our troops have stoically shouldered a much greater burden." End quote. This FY 2018 NDAA takes significant steps towards repairing and rebuilding our military while continuing to reform the Pentagon to make it more agile and more capable of supporting our warfighters. Last fall, I asked the committee staff to develop a plan to put our military on a better track, to repair our planes and ships, to fill out our formations, and to accelerate the development of new innovative systems and technologies. The conclusion was that we need a base defense budget of $640 billion in FY18 and steady growth thereafter. Today, we will mark up a bill totaling $631.5 billion for base requirements and $65 billion for the Overseas Contingency Operations account. It's a compromise to get all of the relevant House committees on the same page. The goal is not only to fund defense adequately this year, but to establish significant predictable growth in future years. Now, I recognize there are a number of legislative steps to go before final authorization and appropriation bills are sent to the President and before changes are made in the BCA caps. But I also believe that the time for Band-Aid solutions that place even more burdens on our troops is over. It's important to remind us all where we've been on defense spending in recent years. From 2010 to 2015, total defense spending was cut 22% in constant dollars. Today, even after the Trump supplemental request was signed into law, FY17 defense spending is 18% lower than it was in 2010, measured in constant dollars. And remember, 2010, the year we're measuring against, was before Russia invaded Crimea, before China built islands in the South China Sea, before any of us had ever heard of ISIS, and certainly before North Korea embarked on its crash missile program. The administration sent us a budget proposal for $603 billion, about 5% above current spending and about 3% above the amount that the Obama administration had proposed for FY18. Their proposal would cut missile defense below current spending, cut shipbuilding accounts, add no additional soldiers to the Army, et cetera, et cetera. While Secretary Mattis and General Dunford testified that they support the administration's request, of course, they also testified that they supported every one of the unfunded requirements submitted by the services. And so, if you look at the difference between what the administration submitted and what is in the mark before us today, it is that we fund $21 billion out of the $31 billion in unfunded requirements. Plus, we start moving toward the 350-ship Navy with an extra $6 billion in shipbuilding. I think it's important for us to remember also that under Article Section 8 of the Constitution, it's our responsibility to raise and support, provide and maintain the military forces of the United States. Naturally, we're interested in the executive's suggestion, but it's our job to decide. We all have responsibilities outside this room related to larger budget issues of taxes and spending. As I mentioned, there are many moving pieces to the broader budget picture that will develop over the year. But for today, and for our responsibilities as the House Armed Services Committee, it's important for us, I think, to put down this marker for what we need for national defense. At the same time, we continue reforms. The two driving priorities of this bill, as far as I'm concerned, are rebuild and reform. Some of the most significant reforms are in subcommittee marks, such as reform of the management of space and reform of the oversight of cyber operations. The Chairman's mark includes another installment of acquisition reform, focusing on online marketplaces, audit reform, planning for service contracts, sustainment costs, and intellectual property, as well as data transparency. I introduced this bill more than a month ago, have gotten a number of suggestions, some criticism, and occasionally even a little praise. There have been some changes in the language from what I introduced that are reflected in this mark as a result of that feedback. I think as a whole, these reforms will make a substantial difference. Let me just mention a few other highlights of the bill. Chairman Dunford made the point that America's center of gravity is our alliances. Provisions in this bill work to strengthen our alliances in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. It supports increased end strength as requested by the Army, Air Force, and Navy. It fully funds the pay raise to which the statutory formula says our troops are entitled. It tries to assist military spouses in being able to practice their vocation as they are forced to move from duty station to duty station. It adds significant funding to depots and other accounts to accelerate the repair of our weapons and equipment. And it makes some progress in repairing or tearing down old facilities that have long been neglected. Finally, the bill supports the administration's request for the fight against terrorists in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. But, of course, there are more questions that need to be answered and oversight conducted about the future course of those conflicts. Finally, before we wade off into the details of this bill, I want to offer a little historical perspective. I suspect most of us have not heard of Robert Patterson. He was the Undersecretary of War during World War II. He was a lawyer, a federal district court and civil court of appeals judge, but he left the bench in 1940 to go to the War Department. As one person described it, he oversaw all fronts of domestic production, from laces for the GI's shoes to the production of the atomic bomb. He died tragically in a plane crash in 1952, but just 3 years ago, some private memoirs of his were published, and there are two paragraphs that really jumped out at me that he wrote about that apply to us. Judge Patterson wrote, "The will of the nation is the final determinant of policy. The leaders of our armed forces cannot secure our safety unless the nation wills it to be safe. Unfortunately, up to the time of Pearl Harbor, our will was divided and uncertain. We had to constantly compromise between what technically we knew we needed and what it seemed likely the nation would grant us. Those compromises came close to being disastrous." In the other paragraph, "The breathtaking display of power with which we closed hostilities in Europe must not allow us to forget that we had a terribly close call at the start. Nor can we afford to forget that it took nearly 5 years from the moment when danger threatened until we reached the pinnacle of our strength in the field. Destiny was generous of time, more generous than we deserved. We cannot count on such generosity again." Ladies and gentlemen, we have a solemn duty. It's not abstract. It's real and concrete. It's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of our nation's security. And as we go about our business today and possibly tonight, I'm confident that we will keep that solemn duty to the men and women who serve and to our nation foremost in our minds. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to begin by agreeing with you on the great work of the members of this committee and of the staff. And I think your summary of many of the things that are in the bill is an excellent example of some of that great work that was done. Certainly in the area of space in particular, and I've worked quite a bit with Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Cooper on a variety of different aspects of that. The idea of standing up a Space Corps, the idea of understanding how important space is in the future is sort of reflective of, again, our policy role as a committee. It's not just up to the White House and the executive branch to decide what the military does. We drive a lot of policy that makes an enormous difference in making us safer. Similarly, as a past chairman of what was then the Terrorism Subcommittee, now the ETC Subcommittee, I want to thank Ms. Stefanik and Mr. Langevin for their great work on focusing on that incredibly important part of hybrid cyber special forces defense, which is becoming so much a part of what we have to do, whether it's facing ISIS or facing the disinformation campaigns of Russia. There is great work throughout this bill. And I also agree with the chairman that the necessity of passing it, as we have done, I think it's 55 straight years, sorry, I missed that point, 56 straight years is important for those policy reasons. We make the policy that helps move us forward in a positive direction in terms of national security. There are, however, two significant challenges before us that I do want to mention, and at the outset, it's not the fault of this committee. This committee has done a great job of trying to work on understanding what our national security threats and how best to meet them. But number one is what the chairman led with, and that's the money. We have in this bill $696 billion, once you include the OCO, in terms of defense spending. Unfortunately, what we do not have in the House or the Senate is a budget resolution. And it's the first time in the entire time I've been in this Congress that we've reached this late date and we don't have a budget resolution. And the reason we don't have a budget resolution is because we cannot come to agreement on how to spend the money. But more important than that, the reason is as always, it seems, we have vastly overpromised what we're going to deliver versus what we actually have the funds to deliver. If you're keeping track of everything, we here on this committee are very familiar with the shortfalls in the armed services and the shortfalls within our military. And we've heard for the last 6 months a parade of generals and think tanks talking about all the shortfalls we have in a bunch of different places, many of which I agree with. Not all, but many of which I do agree with. But we also have a very strong call from many for a balanced budget. We have a $20 trillion debt, and I think the deficit's set to be $706 billion. And also, if we were to, and I know a number of members in here are on other committees, just about every other committee you go to has a very similar list of needs and concerns. Whether you're talking about NIH funding, transportation infrastructure, education, housing, there is a laundry list of things. I've not come across the committee where their opinion is, gosh, you're giving us too much money, please stop. So we have this desire for a whole lot more resources than we actually have. And the reason the budget resolution can't pass is there are not 218 votes for any budget resolution, because there will be some number of people who will object and say, well, it spends too much. There are many members who actually support the Budget Control Act, want to keep it in place, would not want to lift that. And that, by the way, is required. If the money that we have in this bill is to become law, the House and the Senate will have to agree, and the President, to lift the budget caps. And there are many members who are unwilling to do that. Now, ironically, there are also a lot of members who feel that we're not spending enough money in a bunch of different areas. So we have basically not been honest with the American people about the choices that we face. And October 1 is coming. And that is when this all comes to a head, when all of these promises that don't add up leave us in a very bad place. So while we mark this bill up to $696 billion, it is highly unlikely that at the end of this process we're going to have $696 billion. Because first of all, the House has been unwilling to vote for that budget resolution. And again, the House has to vote to lift the budget caps. That alone is a significant block. But of course, as always, the even larger block is in the Senate, because it requires 60 votes in the Senate to lift the budget caps. And just to put a stark point on it, the budget cap number for this committee is $549 billion. Now, that doesn't count OCO, which is $65, $70 billion. But our base bill here is $621 billion. And as the chairman has noted, there are a lot of things that we feel are not funded within that $621 billion. Imagine where it's at if we have to stumble all the way back to $549 billion, which is what's going to happen if we don't vote to raise the budget caps. And in the Senate, they have a concern about other issues. And I always get myself in trouble when I do that in this committee, because I know on this committee, and I agree, our primary responsibility is the funding of the military and our national security. But there are other needs in this country. And I have been told that the one thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. But President Trump's budget made it absolutely clear that that's not true. President Trump's budget plussed up defense by $54 billion to get us up to the $603 billion level and cut all other non-defense discretionary by exactly $54 billion. So the one thing very much does have to do with the other, and included amongst that was a 30% cut in the State Department. When we're talking about the national security challenges that we face and the need for the military response, there's an incredible need for increased diplomacy. And yet we're looking at a 30% cut. You look at the Afghanistan-Pakistan working group in the State Department, which was just disbanded. We are ramping up the number of troops, apparently, that we're going to send to Afghanistan while getting rid of the one group of people that was supposed to be planning a strategy. The Senate is very unlikely to accept that. The House is very unlikely to accept that level of cuts. So we have to figure out that budget piece. And I think the quotes from Mr. Patterson there were spot on. The reason we didn't do it is we don't want to do it. It's tough. It's hard to make choices, to decide what we're going to cut. But it's way past time that we make those choices. Personally, I believe that we need more revenue. I think that the national security needs that have been outlined and that have grown dramatically since 2010 are very real. I think the infrastructure needs in this country are very real, and I think it is shameful that we are not willing to provide the revenue to support what we say is so important to us. But I'm open to other ideas. But what isn't going to work is what we're doing in this bill. This isn't going to work, okay? We're not just going to, after 7 months of not doing it, raise the budget caps. There is going to have to be some sort of agreement here that recognizes the challenges that I just outlined. Right now, we're just hoping. We're doing this $696 billion, and we're hoping that between now and October 1st, some path that at the moment is completely blocked and completely unforeseen is going to emerge that's going to enable us to do this. We need to get past that. We need to actually honestly look at the money we have, and if we are committed to funding all of these shortfalls that we're going to talk about today than actually provide the money. Because absent a budget resolution, what we're doing here today ultimately does not have the force of law. And then the second point that I think is fairly important, 6 months into it, we do not have a national security strategy from the White House. All of the challenges that have been outlined we've heard about, but how do they come together? How do we decide? Because we're not going to have enough money to do everything we want to do. If you were to be keeping track of the various people who came before us and testified about the shortfalls in the defense budget, and then attempted to add up what it was that we would need, I don't know what that number is, but it's way above $700 billion to meet all of those needs. In fact, one of the most disturbing conversations that I had in the last several months was with the Office of Net Assessment, in which they were outlining, again, as the chairman did, all of the shortfalls that we have. And then they said, you know, we had a strategy in 2012. We do not have enough money to fund that strategy. So I asked them, how short are you? He looked at me kind of oddly, so I repeated. I said, how much money would you need to actually meet our national? He had no idea. He had no answer. How can you have no answer to how much money you need and simply keep saying that you need more? That's not a strategy. And it matters in terms of the decisions that we make. Because, just one quick stat for you, we've apparently fired roughly 3 times as many missiles under the Trump administration as we were firing under the Obama administration, primarily into Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Somalia. And that may well be necessary. That may well be accomplishing something. We don't know what exactly because we haven't been told the strategy. But at the same time, you've got the PACOM commander who's concerned about how he's going to deter North Korea and China. Well, the amount of missiles we have kind of matters. So while we're firing all these over there, we should be thinking about the broader strategy, except that we don't have one. The only tiny little glimmer of hope that we got was about 3 weeks ago when General Dunford came up and gave us the broad outlines of a strategy that has not yet been followed through on. The choices amongst all these different threats has not been made. So it was just a tiny, tiny little sip of water after 6 months in the desert. So we need to do a lot more on coming up with a strategy if we're going to adequately provide for the men and women who serve this country. So we don't know how much money, and we don't know what the strategy is. Those are 2 significant problems. Now, we're working through it on this committee, but regrettably, we can't do it alone. We need the House, we need the Senate to make this happen, because for all the good work that we have done, if we cannot resolve the budget issue, if we cannot come up with a comprehensive strategy that makes choices, then we will ultimately be back where we've been for the last 6 years. CRs, short-term fixes. We don't even have, from the White House, a 5-year defense plan, because they don't want to look out that far because the money isn't where they want it to be. You know, we've never had that situation that I can remember of not having a FYDP. You want to plan, you want to build some stability into a national security strategy, you certainly have to plan for longer than 1 year. So as we're working through all of these amendments, I think we need to make sure we keep those issues in mind. And I just want to close, not as well read as the chairman, so I don't have quotes from famous national security people. I'll just choose one from General Dunford, who during this briefing he gave us 3 weeks ago used one of my favorite quotes, where he said, basically, we're out of money, it's time to think. And I think that the first part of that is acknowledged. We have not yet started the thinking part in any great earnest. We continue to focus on isolated issues. We need more ships. We need more planes. We need more nuclear weapons. We need more in space. We have not thought broadly about a strategy about how to best use that money. Because no matter what happens, personally, the path we're on right now is 549, unless something changes. And that would be disastrous. I'll totally agree. But even if that doesn't happen, we're going to have to make choices. We are not going to have enough money to fund everything that we're going to hear about in the next how many ever hours that we don't have enough money for. We got to get smart. We got to make choices. We got to develop a strategy. So I hope in addition to the good work that we're doing on the policy, we can deal with those 2 overarching challenges that frankly threaten that good work in a way that has not been threatened during my time here. With that, I yield back and look forward to the markup and working with the rest of the committee. And I want to thank the chairman again for his leadership in pulling this committee together and working in a bipartisan way. I yield back.
Let me start with a few announcements. The order of consideration for today's markup will follow our subcommittee structure. We will begin first with the subject matter that falls under the jurisdiction of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, and then move to the Subcommittee on Tactical Air-Land Forces, the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces, the Subcommittee on Readiness, the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, and finally, the full committee matters. If a member has an amendment that involves the jurisdiction of other committees, before he or she offers the amendment, the member must have a letter from the respective committee chair indicating their waiver of the right of referral. The same requirement applied before including any provision in the underlying mark. This approach has been the practice of the committee for many years so that we can proceed directly to the House floor without our bill being sequentially referred to other committees. Also, it is the practice of the committee that amendments involving additional spending should identify suitable offsets. Members must not offer amendments that could result in a point of order against the bill on the House floor during its consideration. I also want to remind all committee members that we will not permit any earmarks in the NDAA for fiscal year 2018. It is the chairman's intention to operate under the 5-minute rule in order to allow all interested members the opportunity to speak in an orderly manner. If we get later in the night and there's unanimous consent, sometimes the 5 minutes gets reduced a bit, but we're going to start out with the 5-minute rule. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit written statements into the record. Without objection, so ordered. After consultation with Mr. Smith, I ask unanimous consent that the provisions contained in the reports of the subcommittees and the chairman's mark, which includes full committee provisions, be considered for the purposes of this markup as original text of H.R. 2810, and that these provisions be considered as having been read, and that the bill be open to amendment at any point. Without objection, it is so ordered. I ask unanimous consent the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection. 2 last administrative items. As you can tell, one of the big changes this year are these laptops that are in front of you. We have gone back and looked at the tape of previous markups, and in each of the last 2 years, it has taken a total of 1.5 hours of committee time to pass out amendments. It has added an hour, because I usually start debate before we get finally passed out. It has added an hour to our markup time. So with the assistance of the House, they have loaned us these laptops, and so the underlying mark as well as amendments will be electronically distributed, and I think that will save us time. It will also, by the way, save the committee budget more than $10,000 in copying cost. But here's the deal. If anybody has any challenges in operating these laptops, there are very smart people around the perimeter who can help. And if it gets desperate, Ms. Stefanik and Ms. Murphy have both offered to help members to operate these laptops. So I'm serious. If something doesn't pull up, if you're having trouble, then just let somebody know. We want this to work for members, but we've never done it before. So that's number one. Number two, unlike other committees, we have our markup in open session. I think that's worked well for us. I just want to remind everybody, if there is an occasion on an amendment where we need to go into closed session, we can do that. What it means is we're going to go over to the House Visitor Center to the basement where we have a room reserved that has already been swept, and we can have that classified discussion over there. Obviously, that's a significant disruption, but we're ready to go if that becomes necessary. I just think it's helpful for members to have that in mind before you venture into classified matters. And obviously, in all debate, members need to strictly keep their comments on an unclassified level. Final thing, my intention is to press on. We're supposed to have votes around 1:15 to 1:30. My hope is to press on until that point where we can have a combination lunch vote break. We will have some sandwiches, I think, provided about that time. And then we'll have another set of votes around 4-ish. And we will keep going until we have completed the mark, hopefully not too late into the evening. Okay. Committee will now receive the report of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities. Pursuant to Committee Rule 17 and in consultation with the ranking member, will postpone all recorded votes on the amendments to this particular subcommittee mark until consideration of all amendments to this subcommittee mark has concluded. Chair recognizes the chair of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik, for any comments she'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very pleased to present today our Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities portion of the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act. I would like to begin by thanking all of the members of the subcommittee and the full committee for their active and energetic participation in the hearings, briefings, and congressional delegations that we have held during the past several months. We have taken a hard look at some very important issues within the subcommittee's jurisdiction, and we have done so in a truly collaborative and bipartisan manner. For their hard work, I thank each of my colleagues on the committee. The Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee mark this year focused heavily on providing for stronger cyber warfare capabilities, safeguarding technological superiority, enabling our special operations forces around the globe, providing resources and authorities to counter terrorism and unconventional warfare threats, and energizing programs and activities that counter the spread of weapons of mass destruction. I am especially proud of what this subcommittee has been able to achieve this year in the areas of cyber warfare and cyber operations. Our emphasis on cyber carries 3 broad themes. First, the mark increases congressional oversight of cyber operations by including H.R. 2807, a bill introduced by myself, Ranking Member Langevin, Chairman Thornberry, and Ranking Member Smith, that will ensure Congress is kept fully informed of sensitive military cyber operations. Second, we bolster international partnerships for cyber warfare to counter aggressive adversaries such as Russia, China, and North Korea. This includes support for our NATO partners and those within the Asia-Pacific region to not only enhance partnered cyber capabilities and information sharing, but also to counter and mitigate adversarial propaganda efforts and information warfare campaigns. And third, the mark continues to build and enhance our own U.S. cyber warfare capabilities and activities, principally within U.S. Cyber Command, but also across the services and within the intelligence community, including resiliency of Department of Defense networks, weapon systems, and supply chains. The mark before our members today also reinforces counterterrorism and unconventional warfare capabilities by fully resourcing U.S. Special Operation Command's programs and activities, including ongoing efforts in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Eastern Europe. And it strengthens congressional oversight of ongoing CT and unconventional warfare operations and programs, including various intelligence activities. To provide for the families of Special Operations Forces, we grant permanent authority for the family support programs within U.S. Special Operations Command, a proven program that now merits codification to ensure continued support for families and the force. The mark supports defense innovation to ensure technological superiority and overmatch for our war fighters against current and future threats. We also include provisions that would advance hypersonics weapons research, development, and transitional efforts within the department. Before proceeding, I would like to take a moment to extend my gratitude to our ranking member, Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island. Jim, it has been a true pleasure working with you on all of these important issues, and I look forward to continuing our bipartisan efforts together. I would also like to thank the committee staff who have worked so tirelessly on this mark, including staff lead Pete Villano, professional staff members Kevin Gates and Lindsay Kavanaugh, our clerk Nevi Shadler, and our fellow Dr. Mark Peppel. Thank you, Chairman Thornberry, and I look forward to discussing our Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee mark this morning. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I want to congratulate you, Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith, for the committee mark that's before us today. I know that how hard the two of you work together. And let me especially thank Chairwoman Stefanik for the subcommittee mark that we're taking up at this time. It's been a pleasure working with you over this year, and it has been a strong bipartisan cooperation. And as a result, we've accomplished a great deal, and again, a great deal to be proud of in this mark. Although there are many provisions of note, in the interest of time, I'll just highlight a few. First and foremost, I'm especially pleased with the language that Chairwoman Stefanik and I worked on with Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith to establish mechanisms for oversight of sensitive cyber operations. Clearly, cybersecurity has forever changed modern warfare, and we'll never have modern warfare again without some type of a cyber component to it. And it's important that we have the right policies and procedures in place to make sure that we're leveraging and utilizing this capability in the most effective way possible. So, as I mentioned last week, the subcommittee mark, oversight of sensitive operations in other domains is a core function of the subcommittee, and we are now well poised to pave the way for overseeing these operations in cyberspace. This mark also contains provisions to increase collaboration in cyberspace and other domains to counter Russian information operations. For example, we've authorized funding for NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. Having recently visited Estonia for the CyCon conference hosted by the center, I believe our return on investment will be invaluable to unilateral and partner cyber operations, training, and policy development. Now, Russian aggression in cyber must be addressed head-on, given their activities both at home and abroad. Clearly, we've seen them meddling in our elections and the elections of other Western democracies. I don't expect that their activities in this area are going to diminish anytime soon. In fact, they will likely become more aggressive. So the mark also includes funding for NATO's Strategic Communications Center of Excellence to address propaganda campaigns. However, there's always more that we can do, and I want to recognize Ranking Member Smith's efforts to that end, including his recent bill, the Fostering Unity Against Russian Aggression Act, which I was proud to co-sponsor. Clearly, the mark is strong in the cyber front. In addition to fully funding U.S. Cyber Command, it adds additional funding for weapons system cyber vulnerability assessments. Getting a handle on vulnerabilities in department assets is absolutely vital, and I've been very pleased with innovative approaches to discover and remediate these flaws, particularly the ongoing bug bounty programs following the incredibly successful Hack the Pentagon program. And just for clarity, the Hack the Pentagon program is a good thing this time. It was sponsored by the department, and we learned a lot and discovered many vulnerabilities as a result of that program. I'm hoping that other departments and agencies throughout government will look to the Pentagon's successful Hack the Pentagon program, the Bug Bounty program, and mimic its intent and activities to discover vulnerabilities. And I would point out that this was a great indication of a public-private partnership. Additionally, the bill strengthens U.S. cyber posture, U.S. posture for cyber by investing in the workforce of our country. No matter what the policies are that we have in place, without the right people to actually execute those policies, we are going to be behind the 8 ball and woefully under-resourced. So we're taking steps to close that gap. Certainly we did it last year with language that I had in the mark that made it easier for the Pentagon to bring in talent from the private sector for a period of time, and also for the Pentagon to detail people to the private sector to learn best practices. So this mark this year includes legislation that I introduced earlier this year in collaboration with Senator Kaine to reinvigorate the Department of Defense's Cyber Scholarship Program. This program is very similar to the program sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and the National Science Foundation, the Cyber Scholarship Program. And it's again a good model, and look forward to the Pentagon reinvigorating their program in this area. The MARC also fully funds science and technology efforts across the department, as well as other initiatives aimed at bolstering innovation. These investments include capabilities required by warfighters for current contingencies and other operations, as well as investments to maintain a technological advantage over near peers. We never want to send our warfighters into a fair fight, and it's actions like this that ensure that we do just that. This bill restores funding for crucial programs under development that were not fully funded in the President's budget request for some head-scratching reason. Thus, the MARC before us restores full funding to Railgun in order to take this game-changing technology to the next level. The MARC also fully funds Special Operations Command. It provides permanent authorities for family support programs administered by SOCOM to meet the unique requirements of Special Operations Forces, warriors, and families. And on another note, I just want to mention, thanks to the efforts of Congressman O'Rourke, the MARC also includes a provision that requires notification to Congress if there are changes to current policy guidance for Title X direct action outside of areas of active hostilities. And finally, I want to thank Congressman Wilson for working with me on the amendment to strengthen the Department of Defense's efforts to counter propaganda with other U.S. government agencies and technology companies. As we know, technology companies, for example, Google and Facebook, are undertaking efforts to prevent their platforms from being used to spread propaganda. They also have programs ongoing to reduce the ability to message in this area by terrorist organizations. Clearly, the department is active in these areas, and we want to make sure that there's deconflicting efforts between the private sector and what the government is doing. It'll make sure that these programs are much more effective and going forward, and make sure that these important platforms can't be used by terrorist organizations to spread their propaganda or to be used for recruitment. So, with that, let me just thank Chairwoman Stefanik for her bipartisan work on this extraordinary MARC before us today. I also want to thank the extraordinary work of the staff. I know that it's the members very often that get the credit, but it's the staff that does extraordinary work behind the scenes, getting us to the great MARC that we have before us. And I thank them for the work on this MARC, but also the work that they do throughout the year to promote policies that work to support and protect our warfighters. And we're grateful for your work every day. With that, I want to thank all the members of the subcommittee as well for their contributions and their work. It's been a pleasure working with the members on both sides of the aisle, and especially Chairwoman Stefanik. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there any further discussion on the subcommittee MARC before we turn to amendments? If not, are there any amendments to the subcommittee report? Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 1, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. If the clerk will please distribute the en bloc amendment, and we'll make sure it works. You got it?
Double click.
Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
En bloc package number 1 is comprised of the following. Amendment 012 by Mr. Larson to enhance cloud computing capabilities. Amendment 025 by Mr. Lambourne, directing a brief on space-based debris remediation. Amendment 097R1 by Ms. Spear, directing a report on DIUX activities. Amendment 098 by Ms. Spear, directing a briefing regarding accountability in Special Operation Forces. Amendment 112R1 by Mr. Larson, directing a report on the Electronic Warfare Modernization Pilot Program. Amendment 139 by Mr. Lobiondo, directing a review of personnel and non-conventional assisted recovery. Amendment 232 by Ms. Rosen, regarding progress in meeting Section 1642 of FY18 NDAA relating to U.S. Cyber Command. Amendment 297 by Ms. Stefanik regarding the evaluation of commercial threat information service providers. Amendment 298 by Ms. Stefanik regarding a security and stability strategy for Somalia.
Is there any further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question is on the amendments offered by the gentlelady from New York en bloc. So many is in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments to this portion of the gentlelady from New York?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 2, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. If the clerk will please distribute the second en bloc amendment. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. Gentlelady is recognized to explain the amendment.
En bloc package number 2 is comprised of the following. Amendment 004R1 by Ms. Bordallo, directing a report on National Guard Bureau chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response frameworks. Amendment 013R1 by Mr. Larson, directing a briefing on emerging counter-unmanned aerial system technologies. Amendment 062R1 by Mr. Wilson regarding support to the Global Engagement Center. Amendment 111 by Mr. Larson directing a briefing on improving partner nation response to weapons of mass destruction. Amendment 127 by Ms. Murphy to modify reporting requirements within Title 10, Section 127E. Amendment 192 by Dr. Wenstrup regarding non-lethal weapons for European theater contingencies. Amendment 225 by Mr. Whitman requesting a briefing on automated testing tools. Amendment 230 by Ms. McSally, directing a report on the consolidation plan for network security. Amendment 296 by Ms. Stefanik regarding authorization for the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Fund. Amendment 306 by Mr. Walls regarding a report on 501c3 operations.
Any further discussion on en bloc package number 2? Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on the en bloc package. Recently, we've experienced a disturbing trend as states and terrorist organizations direct and sponsor propaganda and disinformation activities. As the former chairman of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, being ably succeeded by Chair Elise Stefanik of New York, I appreciate the emerging threats posed by the information environment and the role it will play in managing future conflicts. I am especially concerned about the rise in propaganda efforts by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh. They use their extensive digital network to promote violent, extreme messaging in an effort to recruit resources and followers in Western nations, sadly leading to the proliferation of cowardly, homegrown terrorist murderers. The Global Engagement Center, managed through the State Department, established the basic framework preparing the United States to be competitive in the new frontier on cyber operations and to combat state and non-state actors. Increasingly, the propaganda and disinformation threats to the United States and our allies have increased from both state and non-state actors and threaten both military and diplomatic targets. Counter-propaganda is increasingly becoming a critical component of our national security, and we should seek to coordinate efforts between the state and defense. This bipartisan amendment, introduced with Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, would direct the State Secretary of Defense to brief the committee by February 15, 2018, about the opportunities to increase DoD and military support and integration with the Global Engagement Center and maximize its input. Mr. Chairman, I urge passage of the en bloc amendments.
Further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question is on the amendments offered by the gentlelady from New York en bloc. So many is in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Are there other amendments to the subcommittee report? Is the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized to offer an amendment. If the clerk would distribute, I presume the gentleman wants to offer the amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
If the clerk would distribute the amendment. Look how fast that went. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak to my amendment on the table, co-sponsored by Representative Brad Wenstrup of Ohio, that would establish a congressional charter for the Spirit of America. Spirit of America is a nonprofit organization that provides humanitarian and economic assistance in response to local needs identified by deployed U.S. troops and diplomats. A congressional charter for Spirit of America will save lives of U.S. service members and improve national security by permanently removing legal ambiguity that frequently prevents U.S. military commanders from utilizing donated assistance from Spirit of America. The charter will enable the Department of Defense, at its discretion, to utilize donated assistance from Spirit of America to meet local needs in support of U.S. missions abroad. The charter will not place any responsibilities or requirements on DoD, nor will it give Spirit of America any special rights or privileges. There is no impact whatsoever to the DoD budget, and the charter will not exclude any other organizations from supporting DoD missions. Spirit of America is active all over the world, working alongside our armed forces, often in close partnership with Special Operations Forces. For example, to help defeat ISIS, Spirit of America responded to needs identified by U.S. Special Operations Forces by providing metal detectors to their Kurdish Peshmerga partners. The metal detectors are being used to find roadside bombs, save lives and limbs of Peshmerga civilians and American soldiers. On the Syrian side of the counter-ISIS fight, to help build goodwill and trust between U.S. Special Operations Forces and local civilians, Spirit of America repaired a hospital that had been used as an ISIS fighting position and provided a generator so critical medical services could resume. In Europe, in response to needs identified by U.S. Army Europe and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Spirit of America assisted in establishing a radio station which meets the information needs of Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front lines of a war aggression launched by Russia. Despite the 14-year track record of providing assistance that U.S. Special Operations Forces need in the field and they have found beneficial, there is still some ambiguity in regulations that govern its ongoing missions. This was partially addressed by a 2010 CENTCOM regulation driven by Generals Mattis and Dunford, then commanders of CENTCOM and MARCENT, that made clear Spirit of America's ability to work with commanders on the ground, but a broader legal foundation is still necessary, which is why this charter is so important. There are remaining jurisdictional issues at hand, so I will be withdrawing this amendment, but I hope we can get those clarified and revisit upon floor consideration of the bill. In closing, let me quote General Mattis, who commented in 2011, I think of Spirit of America as venture capital. They gave me a flexibility government funding would never allow. On a very personal level, Spirit of America is incredibly effective at making us more effective. With that, I withdraw the amendment and yield to Mr. Wenstrup of Ohio.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Moulton Amendment to create a Title 36 charter for Spirit of America. Spirit of America is a privately funded, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides humanitarian and economic assistance in response to local needs identified by U.S. troops and diplomats. This amendment will remove the legal and regulatory roadblocks that currently prevent the Department of Defense from fully utilizing the assistance Spirit of America can provide. This will enable us to demonstrate the goodwill of the citizens of the United States to the people around the world at no impact on the DoD budget. I can tell you firsthand, when I deployed, philanthropic Americans sent me hygiene products, school supplies, and other items that aided the local community, and it really enhanced our mission. I understand we are still working through some jurisdiction issues, but I encourage you to support this amendment on the floor. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts has withdrawn his amendment. Are there further amendments to the subcommittee mark? Gentleman from California?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
If the clerk would electronically distribute the gentleman's amendment, the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to wait till I can
It's already there.
okay. I use an iPad.
Just click.
There you are. There it is.
There you go.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This is pretty simple. This is an amendment that I have to withdraw because for some reason Oversight and Government Reform has jurisdiction which they will not waive, even though it involves us putting a space robot into space. This is a thing that DARPA has given to a Canadian company, not a U.S. company, even though U.S. companies are capable of doing this. U.S. companies have paid with their private funds, said that they can do this, but this is now a Canadian company has this contract. It was sole sourced from DARPA, and I think that that's wrong. I think we ought to give it to the U.S. companies that are able to do this, keep it in the U.S. The argument that if it's a Canadian company, it won't be seen as a military purchase, and that it's like a United Nations space robot, I think is total baloney. We all know what we're putting into space. Other countries know what we're putting into space, and we ought to have a U.S. company with U.S. taxpayer dollars go into a U.S. company to do this. And the amendment's here on my laptop. With that, I withdraw my amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the subcommittee mark? If not, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the subcommittee report of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities as amended.
Questions on the motion of the gentlelady from New York? So many in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. A quorum being present, the motion is adopted. Committee will now receive the report of the Subcommittee on Tactical Air and Land Forces. Pursuant to Committee Rule 17 and in consultation with the ranking member, will postpone any recorded votes on amendments to this particular subcommittee mark until consideration of all amendments to this subcommittee mark has concluded. Chair recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members have before them the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee mark. I have given a more detailed summary of the TAL mark in our subcommittee last week, so today I will just give a few highlights of the mark. Before I do that, I want to thank the ranking member and all of the members of the subcommittee for their attendance and participation in the overall process this year and the bipartisan spirit in which we have worked. This mark addresses the priorities of the members on both sides of the aisle. Throughout this year's NDAA process, the committee has repeatedly heard that the total force is strained as the services continue to do more with less. We heard testimony from the service chiefs about lacking the capability and capacity that they need to address current and future threats and the increased risk incurred in meeting mission requirements. During subcommittee hearings, we heard how air and land forces continue to face significant challenges in rebuilding full spectrum readiness from years of deferred modernization funding. Significant cuts were made in modernization despite the fact that overall threats have worsened and we are losing our comparative and competitive advantage against strategic competitors. For example, the Army is on a path to fully modernize all of their Army brigade teams by 2035. I'm going to repeat that again, 2035. That is a problem. And the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force has stated that the Air Force has become the smallest, oldest equipped, and least ready force across the full spectrum of operations since the service's inception. In turn, the military services have submitted over $30 billion in unfunded requirements for fiscal year 2018 alone. Now, let's think of that term, unfunded requirements. These are not unfunded wishes, these are unfunded requirements. We are concerned that resources are insufficient to meet the current strategy, much less address emerging threats and requirements. So it is within that context and with the strong leadership and guidance from Chairman Thornberry that we build this mark. I want to thank the Chairman for his work to raise the budget number, the appropriations number, and HASC number, the number that we're using today. 2 weeks ago, we heard testimony from Secretary Mattis and General Dunford to the committee fully supporting the military services unfunded requirements, again, over $30 billion in unfunded requirements for fiscal year 2018. We reviewed these unfunded requirements to responsibly determine what is executable and have recommended to the Chairman that we include $12.6 billion in additional funds to address shortfalls in air dominance, ground combat overmatch, munitions, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities and capacity. A few other highlights of this subcommittee mark include that it provides the authority for ordering bulk quantities of common F-35 Joint Strike Fighter manufacturing materials to reduce costs to the taxpayer and generate significant cost savings, and requires DoD to provide certifications regarding design stability and cost savings estimates. It requires the Army to provide a plan for executing and accelerating its ground combat vehicle modernization strategy to ensure our ground forces are properly equipped for high-end conventional combat. It works to strengthen and provide ISR investment strategies in order to more effectively and efficiently meet combatant-commandant ISR requirements, and it advances the development and procurement of lighter, stronger, and more advanced personnel protective equipment system for all warfighters, while also ensuring women entering combat roles are fully and correctly equipped. In closing, I've stated many times before throughout this legislative cycle that the President's budget of $603 billion did not provide the military a path to recovery for the current readiness crisis that they are confronted with. I strongly support the Chairman's Mark in his efforts to raise that number and get us a higher top line, and I want to thank him again. Our Mark recommends today for this committee $631 billion as a result of the Chairman's efforts. This base funding increase will be used to rebuild readiness and address military services unfunded requirements for previously deferred modernization. While this increase is significant, we cannot afford to go any lower if we are to put the military back on a path to restore full spectrum readiness. And with that, I want to thank the Ranking Member Smith's comments concerning his discussion on the failed Obama programs of sequestration and the damage that it has done. I look forward to working with the Ranking Member on repealing sequestration. I also want to thank Nikki Tsongas for her bipartisan work, and our staff, John Wasson and Doug Bush, who also contribute to the bipartisan work that we have done. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that my complete statement be entered into the markup record, and I encourage members to support the mark.
We got unanimous consent earlier for that to take place. Chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Turner for his leadership and for maintaining the spirit of bipartisanship that is a tradition of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee. And I'd also like to thank the professional staff members for all of your dedicated work to help produce this mark. This mark represents more than 40% of the Department of Defense's research and development budget, funding that is critical to ensuring that our men and women in uniform have the most cutting-edge resources and equipment possible in order to keep them safe when defending our country. Together, the subcommittee has sought to address several pressing issues facing the modernization and sustainment of military aircraft, vehicles, and other equipment platforms we oversee. The mark also directs the Defense Department to provide specific updates and reports on a number of programs and platforms so that we can robustly conduct our oversight responsibility on behalf of the American people. As we move forward, there are still many major issues to be decided, in particular how we fund these needs. And I want to associate myself with the remarks that Ranking Member Smith made at the beginning of this full committee mark. This committee's tradition of bipartisanship is rare in this era of government. It has allowed our committee to produce a bill that for decades has been crafted with the support of both parties to ensure that our military has the resources and tools that it needs to protect the American people and well prepare those who serve on our behalf. But our national security is being put at risk if we pursue unrealistic funding levels in this bill at the expense of other investments in our national competitiveness, the well-being of our people, and the future of our country. I look forward to continuing to work with you all to see that we provide our men and women in uniform with the resources they need to carry out their mission while taking seriously our responsibility to resolve these outstanding issues. And with that, I yield back.
Is there any further discussion of the subcommittee mark? If not, are there any amendments to the subcommittee mark? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 1, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. If the clerk will please distribute the en bloc package. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read, and the gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. En bloc package number 1 is comprised of the following. Amendment 8R1 by Mr. Scott that modifies existing E8C directive report language to clarify the phrase, quote, forward operating location, close quote. Amendment 16 by Mr. Larson that directs a briefing on multifunction explosive detection technology. Amendment number 27 by Mr. Lamborn requiring a briefing on Army wireless intercommunication systems. Amendment number 64R1 by Mr. Wilson, directing the Army to consider the potential for integrating next-generation health monitoring systems on light utility helicopters. Amendment number 72 by Mr. O'Rourke that modifies existing directive report language that addresses Army network integration, evaluations, and joint warfighting assessments. Amendment number 79R1 by Mr. Knight, directing the Secretary of the Air Force to submit a plan that addresses Air Force Test Center modernization challenges. Amendment number 103 by Ms. Spear, directing a briefing on ring-wheel drive technology. Amendment number 143 by Mr. Bishop, directing a report on the modernization requirements for the Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex. Amendment number 196 by Mr. Langevin, requiring a report detailing potential options for the acceleration of procurement and fielding of the Warfighter Information Network Tactical Increment 2 program. And amendment number 214 by Mr. Kaufman, that directs a report on the results of the Air Force OAX experiment. I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question is offered on the question occurs on the amendments offered en bloc by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Are there other amendments to the subcommittee mark? Gentlelady from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentlelady wish to offer her amendment?
Yes, sir, I do. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized.
This amendment that I will be offering and withdrawing would prohibit funding for F-18 aircraft procurement in the coming fiscal year until the Secretary of the Navy certifies that he has reviewed the recommendations included in the Navy's comprehensive review of physiological episodes involving T-45 and F-18 aircraft, and that plans have been developed and funding is available to implement the numerous recommendations included in the report. I do not offer this amendment lightly. I know many members support extended production of F-18 aircraft and that the Navy has significant F-18 readiness problems and needs new aircraft. I also recognize that the problem of physiological events in fighter aircraft goes beyond the F-18. Navy student pilots have not been allowed to fly the Navy's T-45 training aircraft for more than 2 months due to similar concerns. And just last week, the Air Force grounded its F-35A aircraft at Luke Air Force Base based on concerns about similar events in those aircraft. However, I offer this amendment because the Navy's recently published report, the comprehensive review I mentioned earlier, included several major findings that I think all members should be aware of as they and we consider F-18 production, in particular, in the future. First, the report concluded, for the first time that I am aware of, that at least 4 pilot deaths have occurred as a result of physiological events in F-18 aircraft. Up until now, it was not known publicly whether or not any lives had been lost due to this specific problem in F-18s. We now know that 4 lives have been lost. We also know from our hearings, briefings, and site visits that there have been many close calls as well. Second, the report concluded, quote, and I quote, "The integration of the onboard oxygen generation system, OBOGs, in the T-45 and F-18 is inadequate to consistently provide high-quality breathing air," unquote. And as a result of that conclusion, the report also recommended that the Navy, quote, "redesign aircraft life support systems as required to meet OBOG's input specifications," unquote. The report also included more than 30 other recommendations covering organizational, T-45, medical, and other issues. So the situation we now face is a difficult one. We know we need more F-18 aircraft, but we also now know that the Navy has concluded that the F-18's design in the critical area of aircrew life support is flawed and must be redesigned. I'm going to withdraw my amendment today in the hope that by the time of the NDAA's passage later this year, the Navy, in cooperation with the many defense companies involved with the F-18 and T-45, will have addressed the many issues raised in the Navy's recent report. I also hope that by the time the NDAA is done, we can be sure that the $1.8 billion we are authorizing for 22 new F-18s will not end up procuring aircraft that have a serious built-in defect in the area of pilot life support, which is where things stand today. While I know the Navy needs new planes, pilots serving on our behalf must be able to trust the design of the aircraft they are asked to fly into combat. Naval aviation is an inherently risky activity, and I greatly admire all who serve in it. I think we owe it to them to do all we can to make sure the planes they are flying are as safe as possible. I look forward to examining this issue more in the months ahead, and I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
If the gentlelady will withhold withdrawing for just a moment, I think a couple other members would like to discuss this issue. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my ranking member for her work on this issue and bringing this amendment forward. This is what's occurring in the Navy is absolutely unacceptable. We've held hearings on this. We had language last year in our bill. Two of the things that we put in the bill last year required a study as to what's occurring with the FY18. NASA is currently working with the Navy on this issue. The Navy is currently working on a report to the defense committees for us to have a greater understanding of this. These physiological episodes go to the onboard oxygen generating system. This is absolutely critical for our pilots. It also goes to the confidence of our pilots, the ability of a pilot to know that their system is going to operate and that they're not putting their lives at risk. Now, we do not have confirmation currently of any deaths that have occurred, but certainly the committee and our staff are working diligently to both lessen the threat and to look at the reports and to see what actual risks people have sustained. We've held roundtables on this. We have called the Navy in for hearings. In this bill alone, we have a provision demanding that the Navy aggressively take action to address this. We've asked the Air Force to expedite hypoxia research, and we also have put $10 million in for the Navy's Aircrew Systems Development Program that is a sensing program to determine whether low oxygen levels or toxins are present. This is a very serious issue. I appreciate my ranking member bringing this amendment forward and withdrawing it. We certainly know that at the time that we've been working with the Navy, their response has been insufficient, and we're going to continue to work to ensure that, that we are focused on what this is a pilot safety issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to thank the amendment sponsor and Chairman Turner for their diligence on behalf of our naval pilots and the students who are training to be the next generation of naval aviators. I want to highlight the fact that in this space we have had unprecedented cooperation between the Navy, NASA, we've had submarine teams brought in, and also the private sector, the folks who manufactured the equipment that is in question. And I think that this can be a model, Mr. Chairman, going forward as we have further physiological episodes, which in many circumstances are simply a part of the type of aviation that we require from our defense apparatus. And so with this newfound sense of cooperation, it's my hope that we'll be able to ascertain what the root cause of these challenges are, that we'll be able to move forward. But we are at this point bringing everyone together at NAVAIR with the smartest minds not only in the Navy, not only in the military, but throughout the entire apparatus of the federal government as a consequence of Ms. Songus and Mr. Turner's dedication to the issue, and I thank them greatly. I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just note that the amendment that is going to be withdrawn in the initial section mentions the FA-18 E&F Super Hornet, and then generally describes FA-18 psychological episodes later, but this also is a problem that's migrated to the Growler aircraft as well, which is a derivative of the Super Hornet, but it's the electronic aircraft based at Whidbey Island Naval Air Station. So I would just hope that as we'll continue to move forward, that we include the Growler in this discussion. The chairman and the subcommittee and the ranking member are both very well aware of the issues that have migrated to the Growler, and appreciate their attention to it. But I just wanted to note that it is an issue for the Growler community as well. And I'll yield back. Thank you.
Let me just add that if there is anything any of the members see that this committee can do to fix this problem as fast as possible, then I'm on board, because it needs to be fixed. I agree completely with the gentlelady and the other members who have spoken. The gentlelady has withdrawn her amendment. Are there other amendments to this portion or to this subcommittee? Mark, gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up on block package number 2, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, it is so ordered. If the clerk will please distribute the en bloc package, and without objection, the amendments are considered as read. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
En bloc package number 2 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 9 by Mr. Scott, directing a briefing on free-floating rail technology for M4 carbines. Amendment number 34 by Mr. Cook, that directs a briefing on the Army's acquisition strategy for remote weapon systems for joint light tactical vehicles. Amendment number 49 by Ms. Zongas, that requires a briefing on the status of the Army's integrated air and missile defense battle command systems. Amendment number 56 by Ms. Shea Porter, requiring a detailed assessment of ongoing Army efforts to improve counter-improvised explosive device capabilities. Amendment number 174R1 by Dr. Abraham, requiring a briefing on cost-competitive technologies that minimize waste generation and air emissions that can be used to dispose of stockpiles of conventional munitions. Amendment number 205R1 by Ms. Zongas, that requires responses to findings and recommendations of the Navy's June 2017 comprehensive review on physiological episodes involving F-18s and T-45s to be included in an independent review required by Section 237 of the NDAA for fiscal year 2017. Amendment 240 by myself, directing a briefing on software-based mesh networks for ground forces. Amendment number 256 by Ms. Cheney, requiring a briefing on supercavitating ammunition technology. Amendment number 265R1 by Mr. Brooks, that directs a briefing from the Office of the Secretary of Defense on the Department's strategy to transition UH-60A to L aircraft bound to Afghanistan aviation forces. Amendment number 266R2 by Mr. Brooks, that requires a briefing on current research and development efforts supporting the small turbine engine industrial base. Amendment number 292 by Mr. Brown, requiring a briefing on tethered-based multi-rotor platforms that can be used for communications and intelligence operations. I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question occurs on en bloc package number 2 offered by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Are there further amendments to this subcommittee mark? If not, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the subcommittee report on the Subcommittee on Tactical Air and Land Forces as amended.
Questions on the motion offered by the gentleman from Ohio, so many in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Depending on the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. A quorum being present, the motion is adopted.
Well done, Nikki.
Committee will now receive the report of the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces. Pursuant to Committee Rule 17 and in consultation with the ranking member, we'll postpone all of the recorded votes on amendments to this particular subcommittee mark until consideration of all amendments to this subcommittee mark has concluded. Chair recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we begin to discuss our Sea Power and Projection Forces mark, I want to discuss the plight of our forces. While we remain the most capable force in the world, we are losing our edge both in terms of capacity and capability. Our attack submarine force is relying on undersea expansion that occurred in the 1980s. We will be losing 20% of our attack submarine force structure in the next 10 years, despite the demand signal for those submarines increasing by 50%. Fortunately, we have hot submarine production lines and 2 superb shipbuilders to address this concern. Our surface force shipbuilders have hot production lines as well. The bottom line is industry is prepared to respond to our Navy's call for a 355-ship Navy. I asked the committee, are we prepared to watch our Navy and aviation forces diminish in size and capability, or are we prepared to answer the call? Chairman Thornberry's mark is clear. It is time to properly resource the requirements for our forces. It is time we finally start to answer the call from our combatant commanders. It is time we come together and declare as a committee that we intend to reverse years of contraction and finally put our national security on a solid footing going forward. As to the mark, it builds on the 8 ships requested by the administration and adds an additional 5 ships. The mark also recommends additional advanced procurement for aircraft carriers and attack submarines. As to aircraft, The subcommittee also recommends an expansion of KC-46As, C-130J variants, E-2Ds, and P-8s. Finally, the MARC fully funds 2 of the top 3 procurement programs in the DoD, including the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine and the B-21 Raider bomber programs. Overall, the Chairman's MARC points us in the right direction to delivering a 355-ship Navy and the expected projection forces our nation so desperately needs. I also want to extend a special thanks to our ranking member, Joe Courtney, for his leadership and all the efforts that he's put forward in looking along the same lines of what we need to do to create the capability and capacity in our Navy. I also, too, want to thank our staff members who have worked tirelessly across the spectrum with members of the committee and even those outside to put this MARC in the proper perspective and to incorporate as much as possible of other members' thoughts and ideas. I find that the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee remains resolute in seeking bipartisan solutions, and this MARC is clear evidence to that effort. I want to thank the Chairman, too, for his support to expand the capabilities of our Sea Power and Projection Forces, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee MARC this morning. I want to first of all salute Chairman Whitman and the tireless efforts of all members and staff in assembling a MARC that continues to ensure America's security on the seas and in the skies. This year, the subcommittee welcomed both new members and a new chairman, Rob Whitman, who faced a challenging year to pick up the gavel. Nevertheless, in the true spirit of the subcommittee, all members worked collectively on a bipartisan manner to answer our nation's priorities. It's equally remarkable that this MARC was assembled in an extremely compressed and accelerated timeline. This year's MARC takes the first statutory step to codify the multi-year call to grow America's fleet, beginning in 2015 with a comprehensive strategy for maritime security, in 2016 the force structure assessment, and culminating in the 2017 accelerated fleet plan. It has become abundantly clear that growing today's fleet, which is now stands at 278 to a 380-ship fleet, which is now underway, is still inadequate. Rather, the force structure assessment that was released by former Navy Secretary Ray Mabus last December, after an 18-month process focused on strategic needs, boosted the Navy's shipbuilding plan to a 355-ship battle force. Furthermore, our MARC does more than codify this policy. It takes tangible, real steps to execute this policy beginning immediately. By taking active steps to fund the construction of a needed battle force and auxiliary ships, this MARC sends a clear signal to the American people, our nation's industrial base, and perhaps most importantly, any potential adversary, that America's Navy will continue to be today's preeminent force on, below, and above the seas. The Sea Power MARC goes beyond the Trump administration's shockingly tepid request released May 23rd of 8 ships. As the chairman noted in his opening remarks, this was over $1 billion less than the 2017 budget that began again under the prior administration. Our MARC adds an additional 5 ships to include an additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, 2 littoral combat ships, an expeditionary support base, and a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock ship. The MARC also supports the projection forces portion of the subcommittee's portfolio. First, we make the necessary financial investment to continue the development of the B-21 program to recapitalize America's aging bomber fleet. Secondly, we authorize 2 additional KC-46A tankers. And lastly, this MARC authorizes funds needed to upgrade 20 C-130H aircraft propulsion systems, as well as funding large aircraft infrared countermeasure defensive systems for C-130, C-17, and C-5 aircraft, as requested by the Air Force's unfunded priorities list. Additionally, as the chairman mentioned, our MARC authorizes the Navy to enter into a block buy contract for up to 13 Virginia-class submarines for the block beginning in 2019 and 15 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. In regard to attack subs, this MARC notably heeds the call of our nation's combatant commanders like Admiral Harry Harris, who just a few weeks ago in this very room testified that he's only able to meet 50% of the demand for attack submarines in the Pacific theater. He noted that this problem will grow more acute as the aging submarine fleet size declines from today's 52 to 42 in the late 2020s. By authorizing up to 13 submarines in the next block contract, we will be able to build up 3 Virginia-class submarines a year in fiscal years 2020, 2022, and 2023. This projected manufacturing growth is possible through a reliance on proven technologies, steady requirements, and smart contracting methodologies that maximize the known efficiencies within our production and supplier pipeline. Furthermore, members of both parties embrace this opportunity to mitigate the forecasted shortfall of attack submarines as Los Angeles-class boats are retired. I applaud all the members' efforts. Lastly, and of particular importance to me, our MARC continues to spend wisely in purchasing our nation's most survivable nuclear deterrent, the Columbia-class ballistic submarine program. This year's MARC expands the authorities within the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund to include critical common components that will be utilized on Columbia-class that are also used on Virginia-class and the Ford-class carrier. The government will be more like Costco in terms of finding efficient, cost-effective ways of, again, funding these programs. Through these authorities, this priority program, the Columbia-class, will not only be able to meet its critical development and construction timeline, but also continue to realize the cost savings along the way. I'm confident that our subcommittee, MARC, makes wise and timely investments today to ensure America's continued security tomorrow. Again, I want to just conclude by thanking the incredible staff, Dave Sinicki, Phil McNaughton, Bruce Johnson, and Jody Brignola for their outstanding work. Also want to, again, recognize the chairman's great support for this and associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Smith that this is an important mark along with the others. But you know, we need to, again, keep our eye on the big picture, which is that our nation's needs really have to break free from the Budget Control Act of 2011, and I look forward to working on a bipartisan basis to make sure that all of America's needs are met. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there further discussion on this subcommittee MARC? If not, are there amendments to this subcommittee MARC? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk would please distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment would remove funding for one LCS from the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, or OCO, and set the MARC to fund 2 LCS ships total. In the original 2018 President's budget request, the Navy requested 1 LCS. Now, a day after the President's budget was submitted, the White House requested 1 more, and to take this further, the MARC added an additional LCS for a total of 3. The day after the President's budget was dropped, Acting Secretary of the Navy, Sean Stackley, defended the White House's decision to fund just 1 ship. But later that day, it was revealed that OMB now endorsed a 2nd ship, which at the time was unknown where its funding would come from. 3 weeks prior to the budget being released, OMB Director Mick Mulvaney acknowledged that, quote, the Navy doesn't want them, end quote, referring to the LCS. The 2nd and 3rd ships that the Navy did not originally request are being funded from OCO, funds that were never intended to be permanent and never intended to be used for long-term shipbuilding. Moreover, the LCS program continues to face serious shortcomings. At a June 2017 Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, Chairman Senator John McCain stated unequivocally, "One of the greatest disasters I have seen recently was the LCS. Cost overruns have more than doubled the cost of each LCS. Development costs for the ships and their modules now exceed $6 billion and keep rising. Meanwhile, key warfighting capabilities of the LCS, including mine countermeasures and anti-submarine, have fallen years, I repeat years, behind and remain unproven," end quote from Senator McCain. Therefore, this amendment would redirect the funding for one of the LCSs and establish accounts to fund munitions shortfalls that PACOM and EUCOM commanders have identified. In fact, on a recent CODEL led by Chairman Thornberry to East Asia, PACOM Commander Admiral Harris had some pointed words to us at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. He remarked, and I quote, "The lack of munitions and how quickly we would burn through our current inventory in a conflict is what keeps me up at night," end quote. Both combatant commands have identified present needs for munitions replenishment that seem to me, as a humble Marine infantry officer, more pressing and appropriate for this committee to fund than additional ships that go beyond the Navy's request and do not get us closer to the frigate replacement that will correct many of the LCS's shortcomings. When I asked Secretary Mattis before this committee to identify examples of where congressional politics interfere with his ability to provide for our national defense, this is a prime example that comes to mind. Adding these ships, which according to tests literally cannot survive combat, has a lot more to do with parochial congressional district politics than the needs of our sailors and our troops. And make no mistake that supporting these kinds of congressional boondoggles absolutely does hurt our troops, who in turn will not get the munitions and other resources that they truly need. In short, we are forcing on the Navy a ship they do not want, a ship they do not need, and a ship they did not request. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield to Ms. Spear of California.
Further discussion on the amendment. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment. First of all, we have had extensive hearings in the Sea Power Subcommittee concerning LCS, concerning the need for the right high-low mix of ships, having the smaller surface combatants, the LCS, the larger surface combatants, the destroyers, the cost associated with it, the issues with this program. These ships are being built exactly as they've been specified. The issue right now is with mission modules. The only one left to be put into place is the mine countermeasure module. We point out in the 2016 force structure assessment the need for 52 small surface combatants. LCS is part of that. The Navy is on track to select to a new variant, a frigate in the small surface combatant in 2020. Producing at this level allows us to bring costs down to deliver the ships that the Navy needs. We can bring down, if we take out a production of one of these ships, we increase costs by about 10%. Also, if you were to take money from this account to take away from getting to 355 ships, and you put that money towards munitions for PACOM and UCOM, you're going to let money sit idle. In this mark, there's money there to fully fund production of munitions for both UCOM and PACOM at the production capacity today. So this is throwing good money to bad. You can't execute this money because there's not capacity or capability there to produce these munitions. This is feel-good stuff. If you want to make sure that you get something that is usable, that can be put in the hands of sailors, that we can actually put to sea, that we can actually get things done, if you want to do that less expensively, if you want to make sure we transition properly under what I think is a very thoughtful plan for the Navy to get from this ship to the next generation of small surface combatants, then funding this additional ship gets us there. So again, I speak out in adamant opposition to the amendment in what it hopes to accomplish, which is money sitting on the sidelines, and the capability that we need today with these ships in transitioning to the next generation of small surface combatant.
Gentlemen, the ranking members recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in support of Mr. Moulton's amendment. I think it's a good example of what I was talking about in my opening statement about us making choices in the size of the budget that we have. Now, I enjoyed Mr. Turner's comment where we go back in history again and somehow imagine that this is all President Obama's fault. I guess everything is President Obama's fault, and that's the easiest way to think of the world. But sequestration was passed with bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate. And I'm sorry, I just have to bring up the reason we did it is because the Republican-controlled House was refusing to raise the debt ceiling. So we were literally 3 days away from basically failing to meet our obligations. Now, I did not vote for the Budget Control Act, but I will not criticize anyone who did when the choice basically was between that and basically stop paying our bills. So I tried in my opening remarks to not engage in that sort of partisan argument. I think we'd all be better off if we recognized that the Budget Control Act was the result of bipartisan failings and not try to relitigate whose fault it was. It's a problem. It was created bipartisanly, and it continues to be a bipartisan problem. I will also say that it isn't really the only problem, and that's what I was trying to say in my opening remarks. Let's say we get rid of the Budget Control Act. Let's say it's gone. We still don't just magically have trillions of dollars. We still have a $20 trillion debt. We still have a $706 billion deficit. And I'm pretty sure as between, you know, that side and this side, it's the folks on this side over here who are most adamant about the fact that we need to balance the budget. So even to get rid of the Budget Control Act, we do not have $600, $700, $800, $900 billion to spend on defense unless we pretty much completely eliminate all non-defense discretionary spending, which there isn't support for doing. So what I'm trying to get us to wake up to is we have to confront this larger choice. Instead of just, God, if we just got rid of the Budget Control Act, we'd have all the money we wanted, we could spend it all on defense, and everything would be good. Now, I know there's talk we could do something about mandatory programs, although the enthusiasm for doing something about mandatory programs is limited. As I understand it, the chairman of the Budget Committee, chairwoman of the Budget Committee, proposed as part of giving us this $621 billion, a $50 billion cut in mandatory spending, which the chairman of the various committees that would have had to implement that all balked at. $50 billion, $20 trillion in debt, $706 billion deficit, trying to find $50 billion in mandatory savings, and the majority can't even do that, all right? So it is a much larger problem than just saying, by gum, we just got to get rid of the Budget Control Act, and then we'll be able to spend all the money we want on defense, okay? We got to look at revenue. We've got to look at mandatory. We've got to look at all that stuff so that we actually create a budget that has money in it so we can pay for the things that we're talking about, which brings me to this, okay? LCS is a very controversial program. I don't personally support eliminating it. I think Mr. Whitman made some good arguments for why the LCS is important. But as Mr. Moulton pointed out, we're not getting rid of it. The president put one in his budget, and then after the budget was submitted, and I had a quote on this, which I won't repeat, all of a sudden they said, we want two. And they asked, where are you going to get the money? And they said, bleh. And then eventually just found it somewhere. And then in our mark, we put 3. Now, is it better to have 3 LCSs in the abstract? Sure. But we're making choices here. And I compliment Mr. Moulton for offering up what I think is a better choice in terms of where we should spend our money. And if this is what we do in this committee, if every time we try to cut anything, and I won't even get into the BRAC discussion, every time we try to find savings anywhere, there's some good, no, we have to have that. We have to have that ship, that plane, this number of troops. It doesn't add up. At some point, we in this committee, if we are committed to supporting the military that we keep claiming that we're committed to, we got to make a choice to cut something. I keep asking the question, as we heard about all the money that was coming in of the Pentagon people, where in the Pentagon do you think we're spending money that we shouldn't? And yes, that is the answer that I got. Well, you know, we'd have to go back and take a look at it. We'd have to think about it. We'd have to think about it. I mean, what the hell? You know, we're way under all over to fund all this stuff, and you're not even thinking about where you're going to find savings to get us there? So this is a small piece, and I realize that I just took Mr. Moulton's modest little amendment and blew it up into a much larger argument, but I think it is an excellent example of the decisions that we are going to have to make as a committee if we're going to fund the military we want. If we want to fund readiness, take 2 LCSs instead of 3. I think this is, you know, if we can't do this one tiny little thing, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble in terms of funding the priorities that the chairman very rightly outlined. So I urge support for the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Burns, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Small Surface Combatant Task Force report called for 52 small surface combatants. That report has not been amended by the Navy. The Navy clearly has stated through that report it needs these ships. In fact, Admiral Harry Harris of PACOM was before the subcommittee back in April and talked about how he is presently using those ships in the South China Sea, where it fulfills a very important part of the mission. Now, why produce these at a level of 3 per year? We had Admiral Nagley before the subcommittee just a couple of months ago, and he said funding 3 LCS ships a year is critical to maintaining cost and schedule efficiency. Those were his words. LCS is on budget and below the cost cap. Both shipyards are efficiently producing the ship. The 2 shipyards cannot continue without funding 3 ships a year. That's also the Navy's conclusion. 3 ships not only maintains a healthy industrial base, because without 3 ships, the skilled workforce will suffer a 10 to 40% layoff, resulting in extended production timelines and unit cost increases of 10 to 15%, which comes out to be about $50 to $70 million annually in future ships. The labor force is not a spigot. When you turn it off, you can't just turn it back on again. People go and find other jobs and go to other places. 3 ships ensures that the skilled workforce that has been built in both shipyards will remain intact and poised to produce LCS and future small surface combatants on time and under cost caps, benefiting the taxpayers and the Navy that has told us it needs it. 3 ships also ensures the proper supplier base remains intact, and the proper supplier base continues to provide new and repair parts in an economic order of quantities, maintaining low costs for taxpayers as well. The Navy cannot get to a 350 or 355 ship fleet requirement with at least 52 of these ships. We've had repeated testimony to that effect. LCS fills a gap in our Navy's capabilities. LCS serves as the low-cost capability in the Navy's goal of distributed lethality, and LCS removes operational burden from large surface combatants needed for high-end missions. Now, with regard to the munitions, most munition programs have seen plus-ups in funding in the NDAA bill and in the President's request. Production lines are near capacity, and more money won't actually make more munitions. Our Mark also already adds $26 million for the Mark 48 torpedoes and $9 million for the Sidewinder missiles. So we're already doing a lot there. I appreciate the gentleman from Massachusetts' comments. I've invited him to come to the shipyard in Mobile. I've invited him to come to San Diego and actually ride on the ship and talk to the commanding officer and the other officers and the sailors on the ship. And he'll learn far more than he's learned by reading reports. Now, I recently learned that the gentleman is engaged. I know that when he has his wedding, he's going to want to go on a great honeymoon. I can't think of a better honeymoon than coming to my shipyard in Mobile or taking her on the ship in San Diego. So I renew my invitation to the gentleman from Massachusetts. I know this will be a great time for him and his wife to do this, and I think he will learn something in the consequence. And I yield back.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleague from Massachusetts, do not take that advice. You will be divorced by the end of the week. I'm going to associate myself with the ranking member and with Mr. Moulton. This is a disaster of a ship. And I don't know what it's going to take for us to finally recognize that sometimes we have to say no to things that just don't work. In February 2011, the USS Freedom, an LCS, sprung a 6-inch crack in its hull that required several months' worth of repairs. In June 2011, severe corrosion sidelined the USS Independence. In December 2012, the Defense Department's Director of Operational Tests and Evaluation released a report saying the LCS is not expected to be survivable in a hostile combat environment. That's why we've changed the name, so it's not literal combat ship now. It's now called a frigate. In July 2013, the USS Freedom was once again immobilized during a trial run. Also in July 2013, the GAO urged Congress to restrict the purchase of new LCS until the Navy completed technical and design studies and figured out how much it will cost to fix the vessel's problems. These were very good suggestions that were unfortunately ignored. In December 2014, the Secretary of the Defense, Hagel, directed the Navy to study ways to improve the program. However, the Navy doubled down on its failed strategy and prioritized cost and schedule considerations over mission requirements. In December 2015, the USS Milwaukee broke down and had to be towed 40 miles after a software malfunction. That same month, Secretary of Defense Carter directed the Navy to cut the program, which would save billions of dollars. Once again, my colleagues resisted these efforts. The USS Fort Worth was then sidelined in January 2016 because its operator failed to follow proper maintenance procedures. In June 2016, GAO recommended Congress not fund any LCS for 2017. So what did we do? In a strained military budget, did we heed the GAO? No, we didn't. The NDAA authorized not one, not two, but 3 new ships, adding $1.5 billion to the budget. But there's more. In July 2016, the USS Freedom yet again encountered more mechanical issues. How bad is it? This time, its engine will need to be rebuilt or replaced. Most recently, in August 2016, the USS Coronado broke down because of an engineering problem. Every one of these LCSs have suffered from horrendous maintenance problems, with the exception, I believe, of 2. Why don't we go back to the drawing board and build a ship that will work, that won't sink, that won't lose its power and have to be towed in? It's really a disgrace. And to say it's low cost is absolutely a canard. These maintenance problems cost us tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, we can't pay the widows of our military service members what they deserve from their life insurance policies. But we can keep building $500 million ships that sink. I yield back.
Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a healthy debate. It's no secret to anyone that's observed this that the LCS requirements have changed over the years. The global environment has changed as well. Since the Navy started thinking for the first time about a new surface combatant dating back to the 1990s, and as we take steps to continue the transition to the frigate in 2020, I look forward to continuing to work with all members of the committee, my colleague from Massachusetts, who I respect immensely, to make sure that we transition responsibly and effectively, and we shore up any survivability requirements or lethality requirements that the Navy wants us to address. But let us all recognize that what the OMB director says in an offhand comment on Hugh Hewitt's radio station, 6:30 a.m., does not represent the considered view of the U.S. Navy. Let us look instead at what the Navy has actually said and what it has written. And the claim laid on the table that the Navy doesn't want the ship is patently false. As Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, who authored the most thorough and honest and unsparing account of the program, concluded, the Navy is getting very nearly the exact ship it asked for, and in some key aspects, a better ship than expected. We spent months asking the Navy this very question in the Sea Power Subcommittee. The program executive officer, Admiral Nagley, told Chairman Whitman and myself and everyone else that the Navy needs 3 ships per year, and they need it to keep the production line hot to facilitate that transition. Stackley's name was invoked. Let's also recognize the administration was forced to defend a top-line number of 603 that was sent to them by OMB without doing a strategic evaluation behind what numbers actually needed. If you look at what Stackley has actually said about the LCS program is of critical importance to our Navy. The designs are stable, new yard facilities are in place with a right-sized qualified workforce, and both shipyards and industry teams are in full serial productions in order to ensure each can deliver 2 ships per year. Today, the LCS program is on budget and below congressional cost cap. GAO was invoked. If you actually read the GAO report, which is not a friendly one to the LCS in many respects, they conclude that cost simply isn't the issue. Strategically, what are we talking about with this ship? Why do we need it? Why do the warfighters keep asking for it? Well, LCS is not only an ideal platform from which to employ unmanned systems, which are only going to increase in importance in the future, it can simply go places where bigger ships can't. Rear Admiral Don Gabrielson, the commander of Logistics Group's Western Pacific, put it, littoral combat ships can go places and do things that no other American ships can, with flexible large payloads that enable easy integration with regional navies for both military and humanitarian missions. There are over 50,000 islands across a broad arc from the Philippines to Sri Lanka. Larger ships can only visit 50 ports across this entire territory. The LCS can dock in over 1,000 ports. Admiral Harris, the Shangri-La Dialogue was invoked. Later that night, in a meeting with Chairman Thornberry, myself, and many other members of this delegation, you weren't present, you had to leave for no fault of your own, told us that the LCS is playing an increasing role in the Pacific, and they want more of them. You don't want a fleet comprised entirely of LCS, of course, but if the Navy doesn't want the ship, then why are they actually expanding missions in Singapore to deploy 2 ships simultaneously, along with 1 in Bahrain in 2018? If the ship doesn't work, why are allies asking for more? Why did Admiral Harris testify before this committee A lot of our friends and partners in the region have small navies. They want to learn from us. They want to learn from somebody, and I'd rather they learn from us than other potential partners. Their navies are small, and when a cruiser comes in there, or even a DDG for that matter, it can overwhelm them. So the LCS is the right platform to do that. It is also the right platform to train in areas of shallower depth. I appreciate very much my colleagues' concern about munitions shortfall in key regions. I share that view, but I believe the Chairman's mark already takes important steps to address these gaps. The mark rightly adds over $1.5 billion above and beyond the President's budget request for missiles across the services. Under Chairman Thornberry's leadership, the committee has also correctly emphasized America's enduring commitments to Asia and Europe. So we prioritize munitions and forward presence in the Asia-Pacific while supporting joint exercises with regional partners. We also strengthen our position in Europe by transitioning the European Deterrence Initiative to the base budget, which I strongly applaud. This is appropriately where it joins the list of enduring requirements. So I think we are actually doing things to shore up our munitions shortfall. And so I understand this is a contentious issue. I've tried my best as a new member of this committee to listen to all sides, but more than anything else, I've tried to listen to the Navy. And if you look at what the Navy's actually said, the 4th Fleet wants the ship, the 5th Fleet wants the ship, the 6th Fleet wants the ship, the 7th Fleet wants the ship. It's time to listen to what our warfighters are saying and continue building our fleet to meet their operational requirements. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's with enormous respect and admiration for the chairman of the committee and the other members of the committee, but this ship really doesn't sail. This ship is only principal purpose, it seems, at the present time is to show the flag and to get us closer to 355. It's a $500 million, over $500 million for each ship. We can surely spend that money better elsewhere. It's nice to have a ship out there in the ocean, nice to have it in the South China Sea or in Singapore or wherever else until it has to be used, well, assuming it actually can sail. But if it ever has to be used in a contested environment, without a doubt, it isn't going to survive. And so, therefore, it's kind of like, you know, showing the flag and nothing more. We really do need to transition to the frigate, which some say can only be built if we continue to build a ship that really doesn't work well, that is the LCS. So we ought to, right now, say enough is enough. Don't build another one. Use the money elsewhere. Advance the frigate design, which incidentally is going to have to be a significant improvement over the LCS design, so that it actually can survive in a contested environment. And get on with it. But the industrial base is always a great argument to use. And by the way, if we don't want to build munitions, maybe we ought to build an icebreaker so that we could actually do something in the Arctic Ocean. I know, I see my colleagues here saying, oh yeah, Garamendi and Hunter are back to their icebreaker. We are indeed. Let's do this. Why don't we swap 2 LCSs for 1 heavy icebreaker so we can actually have the U.S. Navy in the Arctic, which we cannot now do. In any case, the amendment is a good one. Munitions, we clearly hear we do not have enough munitions. Somebody says the industrial base can't build or cannot supply more munitions, which probably tells us that that particular industrial base needs to be augmented. So I support Mr. Moulton's amendment, and I'm going to, Ms. Beer, do you want more time?
No.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also support the gentleman from Massachusetts amendment. We are constantly bombarded by information about unfunded needs, capabilities that we need to have that we don't have today, and the projected costs that we're not on a trajectory to meet. I heard the chairman of Tactical Air and Land talk about the urgency of these unfunded needs, and here we have a colleague who is asking us to make one of these tough decisions. He's saying that only one of these littoral combat ships at a cost of $556,382,000, that those resources could be put to one of those unfunded urgent needs that we have right now. And while we have these open questions and concerns about the viability and safety and seaworthiness of this program, I think this is a very rational suggestion from one of our colleagues. And so I support it. I urge my colleagues to join me in doing so, and I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to address the munitions issue, where some of my colleagues have said that we don't have the production capacity to make the munitions that we need. Well, then we need to fix that capacity. That's the job that Congress is here to do, to get our sailors, Marines, soldiers, and airmen the munitions that they actually need. I am grateful, furthermore, to the gentleman from Alabama for his invitation. As you might imagine, Mr. Byrne, we are currently planning a wedding. Now, my lovely fiancée has said that she would like a 200-person wedding. That sounds a lot to me, but by your logic, we should triple that to 600. Because undoubtedly, we would be able to achieve cost efficiencies as the per-person cost would drop. I would welcome the gentleman from Alabama to take that proposal to my fiancée. Finally, Mr. Whitman said repeatedly that the Navy needs this ship. My colleague from Wisconsin cited various fleets that would like this ship. My colleague from Wisconsin and I are both Marines. That's like asking a Marine if he would like more chow. Of course he would like more chow. But the bottom line is that when the Navy made their budget request, they did not request it. Mr. Chairman, if the Navy needed this ship, they would have requested it, just as the PACOM commander has requested the additional munitions that my amendment would provide. I yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego. No? Any further discussion on the amendment? I'd yield to myself just briefly. I think everybody acknowledges we need more ships. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the major differences between the President's request and the mark before us is to add more ships. I am convinced that a high-low mix of different kinds of ships makes sense. I'm also convinced the Navy is moving from the LCS towards the frigate. They believe they can do that smoother and better by continuing the LCS line, and it is a matter of economics. If we're going to buy a certain number, if you can buy 3, avoid some the ups and downs of the industrial production costs, then having more of a stable basis for costs, you can ultimately save the taxpayers more money. I think the bottom line is we have cut too much. And this, you know, while LCS doesn't do everything, it is also 1/3 of the cost of a destroyer. It can do some stuff that we need doing, and so I am opposed to the amendment. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts? Those in favor say aye.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Wait, I hadn't got there yet.
Oh, sorry.
Those in favor of the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Is there support for a recorded vote? There is. This vote will be postponed, as I previously announced, to the end of this section of the mark. Are there other amendments to this section of the mark? The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. The amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment would strike language in the mark that eliminates the requirement for the Navy to subject the USS Gerald Ford, CVN-78, to shock trials before its first deployment. CVN-78 has an impressive array of new high-tech advances that propels the new carrier class to face the challenges of today and tomorrow. However, these challenges in these technologies remain unproven, have been troublesome in initial testing, and have unknown reliability in tough conditions. Although the new electromagnetic launch system, or EMALS, Has improvements over the steam-powered catapult, it, along with the new advanced arresting gear, AAG, have proven to be unreliable in testing and in operation. In addition, other CVN class firsts, such as the DBR radar, advanced weapons elevators, and new electric plant, remain unproven in combat. Aside from the new military spec equipment, CVN 78 also has many commercial equipment and systems, that also need to be tested to the fullest extent possible to ensure proper shock hardening. In the FY 2016 annual report on the CVN 78 Ford class, the Defense Department's own Director of Operational Testing and Evaluation stated, quote, "Unlike past tests on other new classes of ships with legacy systems, the performance of CVN 78's new critical systems is unknown. Inclusion of data from shock trials early in a program has been an essential component of building survivable ships," end quote. Full ship shock trials play only a minor role in determining when the carrier will be available for its first deployment. The drivers of CVN 78's schedule are primarily mandatory and necessary certification and training events for the crew, and the shock trial phase itself is only expected to take 2 to 3 months and provides invaluable information for when the ship sees combat. Following the full ship shock trials conducted on USS Theodore Roosevelt CVN 71, only a 2-week maintenance period to conduct minor repairs was required before the ship went back to full operational status. It is critical that we conduct shock trials on CVN 78 as originally planned. Postponing testing to a later date or to CVN 79 is fraught with risks and potential costs. We need to identify shortfalls in design early on so that corrections could be made prior to sending her off in harm's way, and to enable corrective design modifications to be made on CVN 79 and the follow-on new class of carriers. Conducting shock trials on CVN 78 is vitally important, and sending a ship and its sailors who take her into battle on an unproven design that has not been fully tested is something we cannot responsibly do. With that, I'd like to yield to Ms. Spear of California.
I thank the gentleman and once again enthusiastically support his amendment. It's the height of irresponsibility to send 4,300 crew members to sea on a $13 billion carrier with a host of new mission-critical systems that have yet to be tested for susceptibility to shock and battle damage. Really, I can't believe we're having a debate on whether the Navy should test a new nuclear reactor to determine whether or how it might fail under battle conditions. If the language in the MARC passes, shock trials on the Kennedy likely wouldn't be completed until 2025. If those tests reveal fundamental design problems, the Navy would then have to engage in an expensive retrofit of the Kennedy and the Ford, and possibly even the Enterprise, which will by then be under construction. That would put our sailors at risk for years. And for what? I remain entirely unconvinced that the need for the Ford is so urgent that it outweighs the common sense tests that the Navy has been performing since World War II. I support the amendment and I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment. Just to give a little background on where the Navy is, the Navy has already gone through and shock tested every major subcomponent of this ship. The Navy also has at its avail today new technology through modeling and simulation to do shock trialing in a new and innovative way that it's never done before. The Navy also looks at getting into a class of ships before its shock trials. So if you look for our destroyers, our DDG-51s, they shock trialed the 3rd ship in the class. For the LPD-17, they shocked the 3rd ship in the class. Today, we hear constantly of carrier gaps, of not having carriers in certain areas for months on end. The Navy has stated that if they are required to shock CVN 78, it will delay the availability in a rotational basis for CVN 78 by 2 years. So we can go down this road, or we can look at the data that's there. We can understand that the Navy has done the responsible thing in shocking these major subcomponents and doing virtual shocking, which gives them very, very good information, is very highly reliable, and making sure, too, we look at where we are with the current gaps in carrier availability. This ship class will be shocked. We will learn the lessons from that. There are new major systems on board. but getting this ship to theater is critical, especially today, especially with the delays that we've had with this ship, with us being at 10 carriers now, for being there for an extended period of time. This, I think, is critical. The Navy, I believe, has the data necessary to make sure that these major subcomponents, the ship itself, has the data necessary to go forward and to make sure that it will operate the way it's designed to operate. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Further debate on the amendment? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just simply want to agree with my colleague, Mr. Whitman. Delaying this ship any further into the line is unnecessary. I'm convinced the Navy's 2-year estimate is better than the 3 or 4 month estimate or 2 or 3 month estimate that was touted in the reasons why we support this. Is an unacceptable length of time to keep this weapon out of the system. And I've got great confidence in the testing that's been done so far. If there are things that show up, they will show up. And I've got confidence the Navy will take care of those. And I urge opposition to the amendment. I yield back.
No further debate. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to this portion of the bill? Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up an en bloc package number 1 consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. If the clerk will please distribute the amendments en bloc, and without objection, the amendments are considered as read. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. En bloc package number 1 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 007R1 by Mr. Kelly regarding the sense of Congress recognizing the Navy Seabees. Amendment number 052R1 by Mr. Banks regarding torpedo defense. Amendment number 061 by Mr. Byrne regarding littoral combat ship capability enhancements. Amendment number 173R1 by Mr. Abraham to amend Section 3501 to include other than a replacement vessel under subsection F after vessel. Amendment number 177 by Mr. Hunter to amend Section 54101, 46 U.S. Code to clarify that training provided in this section is related to shipbuilding, ship repair, and associated industries. Amendment number 222 by Mr. Whitman regarding extensions of authorities relating to construction of certain vessels. Let me scroll down here, Mr. Chairman, if you'll give me a second here. Amendment number 249 by Mr. Garamendi to amend Section 2218, 10 U.S. Code to provide additional certification before the purchase of a foreign vessel for the Ready Reserve Force. Amendment number 271R1 by Mr. Lobiondo to amend Section 116 to allow the Secretary of the Navy to waive the limitation of funds for the DDG 51 if the Secretary of the Navy determines that the cost or schedule risk associated with the integration of new air and missile defense radar is unacceptable or incongruous with a business case. Amendment number 279 by Mr. Courtney to amend Section 3501 for the cost as defined for loan guarantees under the program provided by Chapter 537 of Title 46 of the United States Code. Amendment number 282R1 by Mr. Courtney regarding the Ukraine's arbitration proceedings against Russia under Annex 13 of United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas.
Is there further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question is on the amendments offered by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Further amendments to this subcommittee. Mark, gentleman from New Jersey, have an amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
If the clerk would please distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would ensure we're not overstepping on the shipbuilding negotiations on this committee. As written, the bill has a provision relating to the DDG 51 destroyers that limits funding in what we believe is an unrealistic way. The bill requires 2 of these 3 ships to include the new Air and Missile Defense Radar, the AMDR. The problem is it should really be 1 instead of 2. It seems like a slight change, but it prevents the committee from getting in the middle between the negotiations of the Navy and those building the ship. So why are we even having this discussion? During testimony before this committee, the Navy told us an agreement is in place to include the new radar in the next 3 ships. We should be ensuring that this bill reflects the testimony and doesn't add additional language that would be involved in those negotiations. When we take a look at what is going on, we just had testimony of the unrealistic nature of building and designing new systems. A quote comes to mind by Ronald Reagan, "Trust but verify." Well, this is a twist on it. Let's trust, but in the event that there is a problem, let's leave the options available. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. It would not limit the use of the new radars. We encourage the use, and the best thing that could happen for all of us is for this system to go in place without a hiccup. We just need to be ready in the event it isn't. I'll yield back.
Other members seek recognition. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I understand where my colleague from New Jersey is expressing concerns here, but I want to go back to what this committee did last year. Under the FY18 NDAA, we have already approved 2 AMDR radar sets to be put on board these destroyers. This would reduce that by 1 ship. The AMDR radar is 30 times better than the existing radar. And we hear in this committee all the time about anti-excess issues, about standoff, about how do we operate in an anti-excess environment. How do we provide more capability so we can counter what our adversaries have? This is that ability. We said last year we want to get this to the fleet quickly. The Navy says we've got it, we are manufacturing it, we have it in hand. The Navy's already ordered it. It will be available for these ships to put in place. The question is, do we want to delay it again, or do we want to put it in place? If we delay it, the Navy's plight to look at ways to reduce cost gets complicated. They are looking at getting this capability to our sailors as quickly as they can. We talk about what the Navy needs today in its platforms and how it utilizes upgrades in the Aegis system, the Baseline 9 upgrades. This radar brings them that capability. If you have to put this radar on ships later, when you bring them in for modernization, the configuration of the radar is different than the radar is there today. You have to make significant modifications to the superstructure of the ship. This really is about making sure we get this technology to our sailors as quickly as we can, to the fleet as quickly as we can. In the en-bloc package, I believe that there is a proper middle ground on this in Mr. Lobiondo's amendment that allows the Secretary of the Navy to waive the limitation of funds on DDG 51 if the Secretary of the Navy determines that the cost or schedule risk associated with the integration of this new radar is unacceptable or incongruous with a business case. Let's give them the ability to say if you need to go to put that over to the next ship, that they can do that. Remember, originally we were talking about all 3 ships in the Flight 3 of these destroyers and putting this new radar on board. We've already said we want the new radar. We've already funded it. Let's allow the Navy to do what it needs to do. Let's allow it to make sure it continues down the line of getting this radar on board these ships. That is 30 times more capable today. I don't think anybody in this room would want to say, let's put a radar on board that gives our sailors 30% or 30 times less capacity than the new radar would when we have a chance to put the new radar on board and the Navy says that they're ready to go, that they can do this, that it needs to be done. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I actually want to speak in support of Mr. Norcross's amendment. And I want to begin by, first of all, agreeing with the chairman of the subcommittee, which is that this new radar system is, again, a quantum leap forward for our country in terms of giving our ships more vision out there. And that's a big deal in terms of some of the threats that are out there. But with this, what we're confronting in here was that Congress actually sent mixed messages in the 2017 authorization bill and appropriations. Rob is correct. We did authorize the purchase of 2 of these these radar systems, but in the appropriations in the omnibus bill, it only required that one of the 3 ships that we paid for last year had to actually incorporate that radar system. It didn't say there couldn't be more, but it only required that it be one. And you know, to cut to the chase here, what we're talking about here is Bath Iron Works, which is the shipyard that is really going to be negotiating for those two DDGs that are in question here. Again, Huntington Ingalls has already agreed to move forward on the 3rd with the AMDR radar system. Bath Iron Works is in the middle of the negotiations right now. They are a fragile shipyard. What they, and I don't want to, it's not my district, but I do know enough about it that when they were required to produce the Zumwalt-class destroyers, the DDG 1000s, which was a truncated program, that has caused incredible disruption in terms of just the operations of that shipyard. So what the base mark is going to require of Bath is really to take on a new modification with, again, an unclear path forward in terms of what the Navy is offering to pay for it. In the last debate that we had with Mr. Moulton on Mr. Moulton's amendment regarding the LCSs, I actually am going to vote against that with all due respect to the proponent of it, because I do think the industrial base issue is something that this committee has to be just totally focused on. And unfortunately, the subcommittee mark, I think, really puts at risk the Bath shipyard, and we have heard that repeatedly over the last 2 or 3 weeks or so as this issue has sort of bubbled to the surface. Again, I want to emphasize, Mr. Norcross's amendment, if it passes, does not prohibit the insertion of this new radar system on more than one ship that we funded last year. The 2 parties are totally capable of negotiating an additional ship to have that capacity, that new radar system included with it. But today, the negotiations between the Navy and Bath Iron Works has not resolved the question of cost and how they're going to pay for it. And I think, unfortunately, the mark is going to sort of force that issue, which really should be an arm's length discussion between the 2 sides. Again, this is not in my district, and but I do think that, as in the case of LCS, we're sort of talking about the same issue here in terms of breaking the industrial base if the subcommittee mark goes forward without the Norcross amendment. So again, totally support the radar system. In the future, this is going to be on all the DDGs that we build in the future. But I think we ought to let the parties sort of work this issue through without having the subcommittee marks language as is enacted. And I do, again, support the Norcross amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. And listen, I appreciate my colleague from Connecticut's thoughts and ideas and concerns. And we've had conversations over the last several days with all the different entities involved, the members from the districts, from companies like Raytheon that produces the radar to General Dynamics, have great respect for what those companies do and what their workers do. This is extraordinarily important. I think, though, that Mr. Lobiondo's language strikes that reasonable middle ground that waives a limitation on funds for DDG 51. So the Secretary of the Navy, if he determines that, hey, we can't execute this, there are issues with the design, any of those things, it gives the Secretary of the Navy the power to jump in and do that. So I think it accomplishes what Mr. Norcross wants to do with his, but it puts it in the hands of the Secretary of the Navy, working with the contractors here that are responsible for delivering this ship, and the Navy, who is responsible for the design and the requirements on Flight 3 of DDG 51. So I'm hopeful that folks will look at it in that way, and that we're trying to resolve this and trying to find the reasonable middle ground with this, and making sure that if there is a hiccup there, that there is an effort by the Congress to make sure we give the power to the Navy to do exactly that. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from O'Rourke. Gentleman from O'Rourke. Mr. O'Rourke from Texas.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Well, Chairman, appreciate the comments, and I think we're all arguing on the same side, that this is a system that we need and it's going to really enhance the warfighter's ability to see. All this does is allow in the event that something goes wrong. We don't think it will, but we all know we're dealing with unknowns, and we just want to give that flexibility. So I appreciate the conversation, but I would encourage us to give them that ability to go forward. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I concur with Chairman Whitman's comments. I think there are two ways in which we are able to engage an enemy, and with the state of the current and future enemies that the United States of America has, we owe our sailors and soldiers every bit of protection that they can have. And with this radar, the number one way is you detect the other guy's stuff that is coming at you. And you cannot be 30 times less capable of detecting a threat to a ship and be taking care of our sailors at the same time. You must be able to detect them at the earliest possible so you can do the second part of that is engage. Now in America, we constantly face a closing gap between the capabilities which we, the United States, have and our enemies have, and they are closing that gap. We cannot allow them to close that gap. I agree with our Chairman Whitman. The amendment offered by Mr. Lobiondo of New Jersey does exactly what it should do. I think this amendment goes too far. I think Mr. Lobiondo's amendment that is in the en bloc amendments does exactly what it says and exactly what it needs to do. When it says the Secretary of the Navy may waive the limitation in subsection A if the Secretary determines that the cost or scheduled risk associated with the integration of the AN/SPY-6V air and missile defense radar is unacceptable or incongruous with a business case that relies on stable design, technology, maturity, and realistic cost and schedule estimates. I trust our Secretary of the Navy and our members of the Navy to make the correct decisions of what is best with our soldiers when given the ability, as Mr. Lobiondo's amendment allows them to do. I just say it's almost similar to taking a soldier and giving him a bolt-action rifle and no other option, and saying, although we have the capabilities of giving you an M4, which is fully automatic or a 3-round burst, we're going to give you the bolt action that is 30 times less effective and expect you to do the same mission. I think the Secretary of the Navy has the ability to say if our production schedules or our shipbuilders, he can take care of those, and I think we'll take care of those. We've shown a pattern of doing that, but I think I agree with Chairman Whitman wholeheartedly. We must vote no on this amendment and support Mr. Lobiondo's earlier amendment 271R1. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Guam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to yield my time to the ranking member, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really quickly, I mean, Mr. Lobiondo, I give him high marks for his effort to try and sort of find middle ground. The problem with that language is that the negotiations right now are taking place between Bath Iron Works and the Navy, and to say that the Secretary of the Navy is going to waive, a provision that would hurt the industrial base, you're talking about the same entity that they're negotiating with. So, I mean, by the way, one of these days, I hope we have a Secretary of the Navy, but unfortunately, it's like a cul-de-sac. You're really just, you're going right back to the same party that you've just, negotiated with, that's forcing you to accept a system that the industrial base is not capable of implementing. Again, I want to emphasize, Mr. Norcross's amendment, unlike what the gentleman from Mississippi seemed to imply, it does not mandate that this second DDG can only have the older radar system. That is, the new radar system is perfectly capable of being inserted in that additional ship. But the problem is that the two parties are negotiating the terms of doing that, and what I don't think Congress should be doing is inserting itself in that process and forcing an outcome. And really, that's all Mr. Norcross's amendment is doing, is just sort of keeping an arm's length distance between the parties so they can work through this issue. We need that radar system out there. I totally agree with some of the prior speakers on that point. But it's a new system, and you're asking, again, a shipyard to basically implement something that last Congress we didn't require. And again, if you look at the 2017 omnibus, it only required one ship to have that radar system. And we're changing really the rules of the game with this mark by forcing it to 2 ships in that 3 DDG component that we funded last year in the 2017 omnibus. So with that, I yield back.
Other discussion? I'll just yield myself briefly. I don't know about y'all, but it seems to me the differences of opinion here are pretty subtle. And I'm sympathetic with the idea that a shipyard that was put at a disadvantage because of DDG 1000, we have to be sensitive to that. But I can't get away from the 30 times better radar, and whatever we can do to move that along, consistent with the industrial base issues the gentleman from Connecticut was talking about, seems to me to make sense. The world is just getting too dangerous, even in the last year, if we see the progression of missiles and other things. So anyway, what it's worth, that's my thought. Question arises on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Request a vote.
Request a recorded vote. Recorded vote on this amendment will be postponed to the end of this markup, this section of the mark. Other amendments to this section of the mark? Gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, in a different committee, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee and the Coast Guard Maritime Subcommittee, chaired by Mr. Hunter, we've been trying to figure out how to
Does the gentleman wish to offer?
I do.
I'm sorry.
First things first.
I was trying to make. I was just trying to make sure. Okay. The clerk will distribute the amendment, and without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Number 248.
Can I start at 5 minutes again?
You can start your 5 minutes again. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for the extra 17 seconds. The committee has been, the subcommittee, the Coast Guard Maritime Subcommittee has been trying to figure out how to build heavy icebreakers for the Arctic. We think we're on a path to do that, and it intersects with this committee. Specifically, the Navy is pretty good at building ships, despite the earlier discussion about LCSs. I guess I'm backing up and going a different direction, so excuse me. But nonetheless, we figure that we know that the Navy's much better positioned to build this particular to work with the Coast Guard to build this particular icebreaker. What we need to do is to make a modification in the current mark that we have before us. And specifically, we do not want to use the Navy's shipbuilding money to build the icebreaker. But we do want to use what is known as an account for auxiliary ships. And so the amendment specifically says that the Navy shipbuilding funds will not be used for icebreakers, but does allow the Navy Defense Sealift Fund to be the locus for the funding for the icebreakers. Now that fund is traditionally used to build auxiliary ships. There are many other sections in the underlying bill, or the underlying mark by the subcommittee, that authorizes the Navy to act as a general agent for the Coast Guard for 3 heavy icebreakers and 3 medium icebreakers. All of that is good and non-controversial, and authorizes the use of the National Defense Sealift Fund, which I just discussed, as the location for the funding for the icebreakers. We will, of course, have to find the funding somewhere to put into that account, and that'll be done in the appropriations process and as that goes forward. I can make a rather lengthy argument about why we need icebreakers without getting into the global climate change issue, but simply stating that the ice in the Arctic Ocean is receding. Russia is way, way into this. They have 40 icebreakers, and they're building more. They're building a deep water port in the Arctic Ocean, and they are moving very, very quickly to gain control of the Arctic. It is necessary for us to be able to gain access to the Arctic, and that's what this icebreaker issue is all about. I think in the beginning and end of this amendment is not controversial, but it does set us up to make sure that we're not using the Navy account, the Navy ship account, but rather a different account as the place in which we will eventually fund this or these icebreakers. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I appreciate Mr. Garamendi's passion as well as Mr. Hunter's passion to find ways for us to get icebreakers built. I completely appreciate that. But I will have to oppose this amendment. Let me tell you the reasons why. I understand not wanting it to be funded in the shipbuilding account. The difficulty is now we're spreading this across all DOD accounts. First of all, there is no defense requirement for DOD to build icebreakers. Not that we don't need icebreakers, not that icebreakers aren't important, not that the relationship between the Navy and the Coast Guard in designing these icebreakers isn't important, but there is not a DOD requirement. So the question is if we now open up DOD accounts and say we're going to fund icebreakers, which means that not only the Navy, but the Army, Air Force, and Marines are the likely bill payers, when you have other elements of ships that are needed for our nation, whether it's NOAA ships, whether it's ships that are used across other branches of government, the question is now DOD funds potentially are the bill payer. So listen, I want to make sure we build icebreakers. I think we have to find ways to be able to do that. DHS has to ante up and say, listen, we realize if this is a national priority, then it should be reflected also in the things that they do. My concern is what this does in setting the precedent and for other service branches under the general expanse of saying now it's going to come out of DOD, being the bill payer for a ship where there's no DOD requirement, and also setting the precedent for other ships that are built, and there are lots of other ships built for the United States government that are not DOD ships that now would be subject to folks saying, well, let's go to the DOD budget because they built Coast Guard ships here. But again, I fully respect the efforts to find ways to build icebreakers. I don't deny the national significance and the need for that. It's just we have to find the right way to do this. And my concern is this is not the right way. It opens up things, and then other service branches are going to be the bill payer on this.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, with enormous respect for your knowledge and passion for all of this, a couple of things. First of all, we recognize, at least I recognize, and I suspect Mr. Hunter also recognizes, that we're not going to be able to get into DOD pocket here. We know that that's not going to be the way it is. What we're trying to set up here is an account in which money, not DOD money, but as you mentioned, the Homeland Security is. Yeah. We'd love to get into their pocket, and really ought to get into their pocket for this particular purpose, because that is where the Coast Guard is under that secretary. We're going to have to find the money in the appropriation process outside of DOD, but the reason for this account is it is a good location from which to deposit the money, assuming we can find it, and have it handled in a way that is effective and efficient for the purposes of building the ships. We already have set up in previous National Defense Authorization Act a mechanism in which the Navy can work with the Coast Guard. The Navy's good at building ships and accounting for it and all of their procedures, as well as their architectural design. So we want to keep it close to the Navy, but we know that we're not going to use DOD money. So that's where we are with it. I think we can work this out. The amendment specifically says we cannot use Navy shipbuilding money, but it does allow this account to be used. It is for our auxiliary ships. Auxiliary ships are many different kinds of ships. Some of them are survey ships that the Navy effectively owns, but there's not normal. They are not part of the 355 ship Navy. Sure. They're separate from that. Anyway, it's where we are. I don't think we have a great controversy here, but we're trying to figure out the most effective way to get us to these icebreakers. And by the way, while they're not naval ships, the Navy cannot operate within the Arctic without an icebreaker.
Listen,
thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Listen, I agree of the need there, and I'm willing to work with you on language here to make sure that we are setting the right structure going forward to make sure that this doesn't create further complications in the future. So I'm willing to work with you on that, willing to work with you on an amendment that we could bring to the full House floor when the bill comes to the full House floor to make sure that we get this right. I just have deep concerns about the language as it's presented here. And I don't in any way, shape, or form take issue with what you're trying to accomplish, the need for icebreakers, or finding imaginative ways to be able to do that.
If the gentleman would yield for 3 seconds.
Please.
I'd like to go forward with the amendment. I may withdraw it when it comes to a vote. We'll see where we are.
Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment and whatever Mr. Garamendi wants to do. The reality is, unlike Army ships or Marine Corps ships or Navy ships or Air Force ships, the icebreaker is a national issue. It's a national ship. We have a national interest to be able to break ice and either do it for the research and development that we're going to be doing in the Arctic, or enable our Navy ships to go move places where the Russians are. This is a national issue. The Coast Guard plaque is right there. You look up here, you got Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. If it shouldn't be up there, then let's take it down. If we need to move that out of here and put it in Homeland Security, I'm the chairman of the Coast Guard subcommittee. I understand that this might be the last year that Transportation Committee even has Coast Guard in its jurisdiction. They want to move it purely to Homeland Security. So if it's not a military service, then let's decide that it's not a military service. The entire Coast Guard budget, the entire budget is $10 billion. That's it. The entire thing. That's the whole budget. There's no way the Coast Guard or Homeland Security can build an icebreaker or 3 heavies and 3 mediums. That's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. What we did is we said that the Navy's integral to this. We set up a joint office where the Navy can tell the Coast Guard. We actually hope that they could make the Coast Guard do the right thing. The Coast Guard can't build big ships. It just can't. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the acquisitions personnel. They haven't been doing it for a long time. And an icebreaker is not complicated. It hits ice, breaks it, backs up, goes forward, breaks it, goes down, backs up, goes forward. You get what I'm saying? It's not complicated. It's not complicated. We're trying to make the Navy put the Coast Guard into their own realm. So again, Mr. Chairman, and I have utmost respect for the subcommittee chairman. If we're going to move Coast Guard out of here, then let's move them out of here. And let's give the icebreaking job in the Arctic. The Russians have 45 icebreakers. 4 or 5. You know how many we have? 1 that works for 6 months. That's it. So if we don't want to do this, and let's decide as a Congress, we don't want to break ice, we're going to cede the Arctic to the Russians, and that's fine. But if we think that the Arctic's important and it's a national priority, then we ought to support this. We ought to support this amendment and the next amendment, which is going to make sure that the propulsion system is made in America. We're not going to buy a South Korean or French propulsion system because somehow Americans can't make propulsion systems for icebreakers because it's so complicated, again, to go forward, break ice, backwards, forward, break ice, backwards. Anyway, that's what this amendment does. The Navy should be in charge of this. We don't want to use DOD funding, but what the heck anyway? What if we do use DOD funding? It's $1 billion. That's 1/10 of the Coast Guard budget, and it's 1/640th of the NDAA budget. And with that, I would yield to the ranking member. Sorry, to the chairman.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm used to talking to
That's all right. Well, Mr. Hunter, listen, I appreciate that, and I don't take issue with anything that you say as far as national priorities. I would offer to work with both you and Mr. Garamendi to make sure that structurally we get this right, because I think it is important, because this will set precedents in whatever we do here in this committee concerning icebreakers, and going further than what we have right now, which is just to say that the Navy will work cooperatively in the design phase and in the acquisition phase, because the Navy knows how to design and acquire ships, whereas the Coast Guard, as you know, doesn't do as much of it. So they don't know as much. I offer to be willing to work with you all to try to find ways to be able to accomplish that.
Would Mr. Hunter yield?
It's your time.
Yes.
What we're looking at here is for the Navy shipbuilding, not the shipbuilding account, but this Navy Defense Sea Lift Fund account being the fiscal agent for the Coast Guard's development of the icebreaker. It's for all the reasons that have been cited, while the Coast Guard does build ships, they're small. They might be pretty good at frigates, actually. But in any case, this is a fiscal agent issue. We're going to have to find the money outside of the current DOD budget. Mr. Hunter really brought something to me very quickly, and that is the Coast Guard's up there. They are a military, they are a national defense element. They have two tasks. One is a civil, and the other is military. They are as much a military task as any of the others banners up there on the wall. Anyway, I'm going to continue with this amendment, and we've got maybe, if I keep talking, 12 hours ahead of us, and maybe time to work this out.
I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Yeah, I want to thank Mr. Whitman for being committed. I may be the third person on this committee as passionate about icebreakers as Mr. Garamendi and Mr. Hunter. But, you know, I've been at this icebreaker issue for 17 years on Transportation Committee and on this committee, and we're getting there. We're about 10% of the way there to get a solution, but we're getting there. But I do want to note that and not to be critical of the chairman, but just because DOD hasn't made this a requirement, this committee has a history of defining what ought to be a defense requirement, what ought to be a national security requirement. You look at Predator drones, you look at MRAP and up armor Humvees. That came out of this committee, and the Pentagon followed. So we don't need to wait for the Pentagon to tell us what is a national security requirement. And the access to the Arctic, especially the access to the Arctic that is U.S. water, that is inside internationally recognized borders and lines, access to that water is critical for us to protect it. And having an icebreaker fleet to do just that is critical. So there is a national security requirement. Just because the Pentagon has not yet come to our wisdom does not mean there is not a requirement. And so I want to underline that first. The second thing I would just note, again, to emphasize Mr. Hunter and Mr. Garamendi's commitment on this issue from the Transportation Committee. This is not, we have to find a solution. We don't need one more study from either the Coast Guard or the Navy to help us decide that this is a requirement. So I hope that whatever solution we come up with is not another study, because there is a stack of studies on this issue, both out of Coast Guard and the Navy and the Pentagon for that matter. So whatever we get to, I hope it's real, it includes real money, and it moves this country forward on an icebreaker fleet. And with that, I'll yield back.
Further discussion on, Mr. Turner?
Just a brief comment as Mr. Garamendi is considering whether or not he withdraws this amendment. In reviewing what we have on our screens for log 248, it appears that Mr. Garamendi's amendment has a grammatical error, which actually renders it nonsensical. So you may want to consider taking a look at it in your calculus as to whether or not you withdraw this version.
Mr. Conaway.
Just a point of clarification. What I've heard is that you want the Navy to be the fiscal agent for this. Would the Navy also be required to be the acquisition agent, design agent, program manager, all the way through? In other words, put additional restraints on that system already?
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
Yes. The answer is we want the Navy to do this. Because
So
the
you're
Coast
asking
Guard,
the Navy to
Coast
spend
Guard
money
can't
on
do
this
it.
deal.
It'll be twice the cost and built badly if the Coast Guard gets to do it. We want the Navy to do it. We want to get extra money. We don't want to use DOD money if we don't have to, but we want the Navy to be in charge of this.
So would the extra money that you'd commit to fund the Navy's back office costs for doing all this?
So there's no money in this. We want to use the same agent that we set up in this committee for shipbuilding to be able to use that in case the Appropriations Committee decides to put money into this. We simply want to use this bucket. There's no money like going into it now, but we're going to use this as an agent. This is what we're going to use to get it done if extra money is put in by Appropes.
Okay, well, we're reclaiming all the time. I just want to make sure, though, that this committee understands that we're putting additional burdens on the Navy to do this. If the new money going into the account would, in fact, fund the acquisition costs, design costs, program manager costs, all those things associated with that program, then I think that needs to be a commitment as well.
Will the gentleman yield? Sure. Once more. So we established a joint program office last year in this committee that makes the Navy oversee basically what, Secretary Stackley has looked at this. They started a joint program office just for this because they understand that the Coast Guard can't do this by itself. It'll mess it up. As a chairman of that subcommittee for 5 years, they will mess it up. You want the Navy to do this, otherwise it won't get done.
Okay, well, if they've already set up the system to make it happen, why are we doing this?
To create the tranche to put the bucket to be able to put money in to do it when we finally get around to doing it. Because the Coast Guard and Homeland Security doesn't have the ability that we do. They don't have a shipbuilding account. They don't have an SCN account. They don't have that stuff. We're just trying to use this as an agent to get to where we want to be, building icebreakers.
Yeah, John.
Would the gentleman
yield to John? Yes, sir. You're John.
Yes. To add a little, perhaps, clarification, we're essentially doing two things here. One, saying we will not use the Navy shipbuilding account, period. We're not going to use that account. That's the 355 ship, the effort to get their account. We're not going to do that. What we want to do is the auxiliary account, which has been used for all kinds of ships that are not of the 355 fleet. And that's everything from, I guess, research ships and other kinds of ships that are naval but not 355. We're looking for a fiscal agent, and the Chairman is quite, Mr. Hunter is quite correct when he says we've been working very closely with the Navy for the last year and a half, and in fact they are moving forward with the design and have made great progress in the design of the ship itself, of the icebreaker itself. This is how we would then fund the fiscal agent that would.
No, I understand, John. I just want to make sure that I knew what additional draw on the Navy's resources would be. So, thank you.
You mentioned acquisition cost and other kinds of other expenses that would be in the process of getting this icebreaker built. It would be we're not there yet, but
Yeah, that's it. That's all.
Whatever the appropriation might be for the icebreaker, we could easily write into that if there are additional costs to the Navy for managing it, that would be part of that expense.
Mr. Lamborn.
I yield my time to Representative Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Chairman, I just want to reflect. I think there's agreement here on what we need to do. I think what's problematic here is the very vast and general nature of this language. I think we can come up with something that gets us to where we need to be by making sure that it's focused, it's restricted, and it's specific to what Mr. Garamendi and Mr. Hunter are trying to accomplish. I believe that we can do that. I just think doing it this way creates unintended consequences that we really need to be mindful of. So, as I said, I'm willing to work with both Mr. Hunter and Mr. Garamendi to get this to happen, and willing to support it in as well as yes, I'll yield in just a second. I will support it in conjunction, in consultation with folks on both sides of the aisle, but want to make sure that we get this language right. I yield, Mr. Hunter.
The gentleman yield. To Mr. Garamendi, I would say if the subcommittee chairman and the chairman are willing to work with us on this, and let's try to do it. And I would withdraw. I mean, I would respectfully recommend withdrawing. If
yield.
This is important. People get it.
I yield.
Mr. Lambert, thank you for yielding. We're going to have lunch pretty soon. Maybe we can get this done over lunch. I think it's fairly simple. We just need to work out some language.
Okay, the chair's confused. Did you withdraw the amendment or not? The question's on the amendment. Okay. The amendment is withdrawn. Editorial comment, I hope y'all look at something that can allow us to lease icebreakers too, so we can get them faster and get around OMB's problem. But anyway, all right, the amendment is withdrawn. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my request for a recorded vote on my amendment that was rejected.
With that objection, it is so ordered. We have one more amendment filed on this portion of the bill. Gentleman from California.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment will probably require that the previous amendment that has now been withdrawn come back in some form, but I do want to take it up because it speaks to the Buy American provisions. The language in the legislation before us sets out an icebreaker that will be built. The previous amendment is not necessary for this particular one because we already have language in the bill. What we want to do, Mr. Bridenstine made a suggestion having to do with whether some elements of the icebreaker, some components of the icebreaker are not presently being able to be made in America. And in his writing of that amendment, or that language, which is now in the base bill, it basically precludes the Buy America provisions. And what we are doing with this amendment is to eliminate one sentence, and that would then allow the icebreaker to move forward when it is built and funded, or when it is funded and then built, to have the normal Buy America provisions that are used for all of the naval vessels as well as for the Coast Guard vessels. That's what it does, and I think we don't have any opposition to this. It maintains the Buy American provisions, but it also gives to the Commandant a waiver authority if any of the components of the icebreaker, should it ever be built, are not available from America. And that's it. And I would therefore ask for a vote.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I appreciate Mr. Garamendi's efforts here. One of the reasons that the discussion has been about what opportunities are there for us to build icebreakers is the United States hasn't built icebreakers for years. Not that it can't, not that it shouldn't go forward and be looking at those things. The element here is of time. And the element I think that does need to be addressed, and it should be debated here in this committee, is a time element that's added to this if we are going to now go to a yard here that hasn't built it, that hasn't designed one for decades, whereas the only places around the world that are designing and building icebreakers are outside the United States. So if we take a step back now, and it's been going in the direction of saying what foreign partners are out there to be able to do this, there is a time element of that. So that's the thing I would ask folks to consider here. It's not that we don't want U.S. yards to build icebreakers, not that they can't build icebreakers, but technologically, from a design standpoint, if we take steps back now and say, okay, this is going to be fully under the Buy America provisions, there is a time element of this, and it doesn't, as Mr. Hunter pointed out in the language, it doesn't stop, as we have right now, a foreign yard from partnering with the U.S. yard to say, hey, let's build icebreakers in a joint manner and not hiccup on time. So I think the provisions are there. Now, I know Mr. Hunter will argue in the other side that the provisions also allow the consideration of a U.S. build under the same conditions. And again, I just want people to understand the time elements that are of issue here with this particular Buy America provision that restricts it solely there at the onset of building icebreakers.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes. Yeah, I'll yield.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The language that is currently in the bill has Buy America for everything except components. Components are engines, propellers, radar systems, whatever else. The basic hull already has a Buy America provisions in it. The language that was inserted in the markup from the subcommittee, I think intended to deal with those component parts that are currently not built in America and not likely to be built in America. And these are some of the propulsion systems, Mr. Hunter's back up and go forward type of components. So what we want to do here is to not eliminate from the Buy America provisions engines, other things that are available in the United States, and those engines are available in the United States, and are many of these things, but rather to go back to the underlying Buy America provisions that the U.S. Navy uses and the Coast Guard uses, and in those provisions there are such things as cost, availability, timeliness, and quality. And so the Commandant, and depending how the Navy works with the Commandant, the Navy and the Commandant can waive the Buy America provisions for timeliness, for cost, for quality, and the like. So it's just that I think it was a drafting decision, or an error, frankly, that eliminated the Buy American provisions for all components except for the hull. Okay. And so that's where we are, and this goes back to the Buy America provisions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I want to yield Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is probably the same discussion that the British had when they realized they couldn't make aircraft carriers anymore. They were probably sitting here in their parliament, and they said, well, we can't do it here, so we're going to look at foreign designs, and we'll probably have to do it foreign, so let's not even put in a requirement that it's got to be made in Britain. Let's just buy it from whoever. The British cannot make aircraft carriers anymore. The people that the sun never set on the British Empire, it's set all over the British Empire because there is no British Empire, because they're not there. The people that rule the oceans for thousands of years can't build an aircraft carrier. They had this same discussion. There's already a waiver. The waiver under current law, application of the limitation would cause unreasonable costs to be delayed or delays to be incurred. Satisfactory quality items manufactured by an entity that is part of the national technology and industrial base are not available. Application of the limitation is not in the national security interest of the U.S. There's already waivers there. Let's go look for the system. Let's encourage American industry to go, hey guys, we're going to build an icebreaker. Can you build the system? Let's go look for it. If we can't build it, then we'll waive it and we'll buy it from the Russians like we do with jet engines. Sorry, I yield back.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much respect the gentleman from California's view and his colorful way of framing the debate, but I agree more broadly with Chairman Whitman's position. You know, I think there's a happy medium here. We need to ensure that the Coast Guard has the same ability to leverage commercial off-the-shelf designs and technologies from outside the U.S. for the icebreaker. I'm very excited at the prospect of a broader agreement on how do we build icebreakers. I think there's very much a need for it. But these technologies could help the Coast Guard reduce costs and I think provide the best value for the taxpayers. As the Chairman laid out, we haven't built a polar heavy icebreaker in over 40 years. Modern icebreakers, including those of other Arctic powers, are using advanced technologies. We need to keep pace. We can't fall behind. And icebreaker technology has undergone significant advances over the last 25 years. Most of this, unfortunately, has happened in Europe. One of the biggest advances has been the development of podded electronic propulsors, which is both more efficient and allows for more design flexibility than other systems. Yet the only worldwide manufacturer of ICE qualified of this equipment is European. The Coast Guard currently leverages podded propulsion on the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Mackinac. A more efficient system, from my view, means saving for the Coast Guard and for the taxpayers. And if a system's cheaper and more efficient, why exclude them from competing? And I think Mr. Bridenstine's amendment, the underlying one, doesn't guarantee the Coast Guard will decide to go with a foreign-built propulsion system, but it just gives them the opportunity to leverage foreign technologies as they have in the past. And I just don't think Congress should stand in the Coast Guard's way by prohibiting them from acquiring world-class technology that we need now. And instead, the Coast Guard and the Navy should be given maximum flexibility to explore all technology options. I yield.
Further discussion? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I would just note the Brits launched the carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, 1 day ago, by the way. Just saying. Okay. We're now going to proceed to a vote on those amendments where a roll call was ordered. And that is on Mr. Moulton Amendment number 160, which They don't have it right? Yeah, I think actually the vote is on 121R1, which reduces the LCS ship by 1. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Thornberry.
No.
Chairman Thornberry votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones votes aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Ms. Bordallo. Ms. Bordallo votes aye. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster. Ms. Songus. Ms. Songus votes aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes no. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes no. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman votes no. Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. O'Rourke votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes no. Ms. Hanabusa. Ms. Hanabusa votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Ms. Shea Porter. Ms. Shea Porter votes aye. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. McEachin. Mr. McEachin votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes no. Mrs. Murphy. Aye. Mrs. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Khanna.
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes no. Mr. O'Halloran. Mr. O'Halloran votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes no. Mr. Walls. Mr. Walls votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes no. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there were 19 aye votes, 43 no votes.
The amendment is not adopted. There are no further amendments to this portion of the mark. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the subcommittee report of the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces as amended.
Questions on the motion offered by the gentleman from Virginia? So many as in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, a quorum being present, and the motion is adopted. I think we're going to keep rolling. We're supposed to have votes about 1:30. There are some sandwiches back there, but don't miss your amendment. And we will make as much progress as we can before we have to break for votes. The committee will now receive the report of the Subcommittee on Readiness. Pursuant to Committee Rule 17 and in consultation with the ranking member, we will again postpone the recorded votes on amendments to this particular subcommittee mark until consideration of all the amendments to this subcommittee mark has concluded. Chair recognizes the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members have before them the Readiness Subcommittee mark. I would like to begin by thanking Ranking Member Congresswoman Madeline Badallo of Guam for her tireless efforts and participation in the process, and thank the Readiness Subcommittee members on both sides of the aisle for their attendance and participation at the hearings and briefings throughout the year. Additionally, the extraordinary staff worked diligently to make this mark happen. We appreciate your effective dedication. Thank you all for your resolve. Over the past several months, we've heard testimony from each of our service branches about the critical necessity to address our military's readiness shortfalls. Here today, we have the responsibility to reduce the risk for our warfighters by making sure that they are well trained and supported, and that the equipment they use is properly maintained and combat ready. I believe this mark accomplishes this task. The product of bipartisan negotiations, the mark before you incorporates legislative provisions and direct report language that I believe will make significant progress in resolving our most critical readiness concerns. Last week, I gave a more detailed account of the readiness mark, but today I'll review a few of the highlights. Specifically, this mark provides for increased military construction over 2017 levels, gives the Department of Defense more responsive facility construction, repair, and real estate authorities, and extends and expands several of DoD's civilian hiring authorities so that critical manpower capability gaps, especially in our defense industrial base, can be filled quickly. Further, it directs several assessments of the military department's plans to rebuild readiness, enhance exercises, modernize training requirements, and address shortfalls in our public shipyards. We've also recommended that the chairman include over $3 billion in additional operation and maintenance funds for other things such as ship and aircraft depot maintenance, aviation training and readiness, and long-neglected facilities sustainment, restoration, and modernization accounts. I urge the members of the full committee to support the readiness mark, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Guam, Ms. Badallo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I extend special thanks to our Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith. And I would just thank all of the staff who have spent countless hours working with us to develop this bill. And it has been a real pleasure working with Chairman Wilson and our subcommittee staff for working cooperatively on the readiness portion of this bill. There is a lot of good in this bill, and as I stated during our subcommittee markup, this bill continues efforts to fund critical readiness accounts that have been the bill payer for nearly 2 decades of enduring conflict. It streamlines efforts to track and communicate readiness needs and its steps taken to address them. And furthermore, the bill makes targeted investments and provides additional authorities and flexibility for military construction. Many of the facilities that our service members live and train in need critical repair and modernization, and the deferred investment in facilities has only compounded costs. So this mark helps address these shortfalls and recapitalizes critical infrastructure. This bill also addresses several critical issues facing Guam. Most notably, it includes a provision that addresses the critical workforce crisis that is compromising the labor force needed to support construction and health care deficits associated with the realignment of Marines to Guam. This is language that we passed last year, and I hope we can ensure an adequate solution is sustained in conference. It is also my hope that moving forward, we can ensure that we are doing what we need to engage the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. As many of our colleagues like to say, a budget is a strategy document, and despite the lack of a coherent strategy by the administration, I do not believe we can afford to send mixed signals to our friends in that region. To that end, I have appreciated the chairman and the ranking member's efforts to signal support not just to the European theater, but the theater of today and tomorrow in the Indo-Asia-Pacific area. However, I am concerned by what I believe to be an over-reliance on what has been and remains a budget gimmick, relying on OCO for base requirements. With $75 billion for OCO in our mark, we are discussing a $700 billion authorization for the Department of Defense. By comparison, that is nearly 20 times as much as was requested by the President for the State Department. So I am concerned that we are creating a vicious circle by underfunding agencies critical to our national interest, resulting in deeper international conflicts, for which we will need to allocate additional OCO funding now and in the future, or DOD funding now and in the future. So I hope that we in Congress will reserve this trend and allocate resources to appropriately support our defense and non-defense agencies that advance our national security interests. So again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all of my colleagues for your work on this important bill, and I look forward to continuing the discussion as the process evolves. And I yield back.
Chair yields the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a brief moment. I thank the chair and the ranking member of the Readiness Subcommittee for their work, but I particularly want to thank Vicki Plunkett, who is retiring. This is her 11th and final markup as the member of the committee staff. And as the chairman and I and all members of this committee note, we have the best staff in Congress, without question. The work that you have to do, I mean, we have the largest committee in Congress, which means Vicki and all of you have to deal with all of us and put together this bill, and the work that is done constantly is impressive and a great service to our country. And Vicki has been fantastic for the entire time I've been in Congress. Appreciate her service. Congratulate her on her retirement. So just thank you very much for your service to this committee and to the country. And we look forward to a great retirement. And thanks again. It's been great working with you. And if we just give a round of applause.
Mr. Chairman.
These are not easy issues that she works on, so we really appreciate and will miss her expertise. I yield back.
Let me just add that we are very grateful for all of the help that Ms. Plunkett has provided this committee. The ranking member failed to note, however, that some of her most distinguished accomplishments have been working as part of the Texas delegation, where she was Deputy Chief of Staff for our former colleague, Congressman Solomon Ortiz. 23 years working with Congress and 23 years of various ones of us relying on your expertise and judgment. We are very grateful. By the way, I hope that you understand you can't leave until this bill is signed into law. Just saying. Does gentlelady from Guam wish me to yield to her?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do wish to say something about Vicki. And to thank her for her 23 years in Congress and 10 years on this committee. Her thoughtful and deliberate approach to complex problems has been a critical asset for many of us on the Readiness Subcommittee. And throughout the years, she has continually impressed me with how she commands the respect of others through her intelligence, her candor, and her thoughtfulness. And I have enjoyed seeing her no-nonsense attitude surprise many, given her soft-spoken demeanor. So I have further appreciated her friendship in council, and her daily presence here in Capitol Hill will be deeply missed. So I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you, and on Guam we say si jus ma'asi, Vicky. And I yield back.
I'd yield briefly to the chairman of the subcommittee.
And I'd like to join with the ranking member in commending you for your service, and of course any training that you had by Solomon Ortiz would be positive. Congratulations, Godspeed. Thank you.
Any further discussion on this portion of the mark? Gentlelady from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to speak briefly about Section 2831, which is found on page 22. But before that, I'd also like to say thank you to Vicki. When I returned to Congress, she was the first person who came running up to me and gave me an amazing hug. So thank you, Vicki, and I'll miss you. Mr. Chairman, this section, 2831, beginning on page 22, talks about the withdrawals of public land for military purposes. This section would indefinitely withdraw public land associated with certain military installations. It was included in the mark with the input of the Department of Defense as a means to reduce planning costs associated with renewing existing withdrawals. Typically, Congress provides 20 to 30-year withdrawals of public land for military purposes. If the land is still needed for military purposes at the end of that period, the Department of Defense works with the Department of Interior to complete an environmental impact statement before requesting a new withdrawal from Congress. The customary review allows for public input and provides the Department of Interior with an opportunity to check up on any resource and management needs. It does cost money and take time to complete, but it is a system that has worked well since at least World War II. I recognize that some find this process costly, time-consuming, and perhaps even duplicative, and have been trying to identify a solution to reduce processing time and save money on planning. If we want to find a working solution to these concerns, it's important that we get it right. So I look forward to working with you and others to make sure that this is the answer we are looking for. DOD is a great steward of public lands, but Section 2831 is a big departure from the status quo. We have not had the opportunity to get meaningful input from the Department of Interior, and I would like to get a commitment to continue working on this section in conference. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Generally yields back. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Bordallo, and professional staff for working with me to include a provision in this subcommittee mark stressing the importance of maintaining a modern, efficient, and resilient utility infrastructure for the military. In order to support the missions of today and tomorrow, we must ensure that we are not relying on aging and inefficient systems. This committee must work with the department to look at ways to reinvest, operate, and sustain its utility systems. We must invest in an infrastructure that can endure unforeseen events such as natural disasters and be capable of continuing its mission during these events. The provision included in the mark will require DOD to provide this committee with a briefing on the conditions of the current utility systems and their plans for modernization and recapitalization of its aging utility systems. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Further discussion on this subcommittee mark. Are there amendments to this subcommittee mark? Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment on the screen.
The clerk will electronically distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a district with 5 major military installations, and people are coming and going all the time, and I rarely question DOD and whether they're bringing or taking people away. it's just accepted as part of the normal course of operating the military. But occasionally, a decision is made that just really does not make sense, and that's what this amendment addresses. This would prevent the Air Force from spending O&M funds on the movement or divestiture of C-21 aircraft from Peterson Air Force Base. Representative Kaufman, who's already also in the Colorado delegation, supports me in this. We just recently learned of the complete divestment of the 200th Airlift Squadron's 20 military members and 2 C-21 aircraft after reading the Air Force's budget justification attached to the President's budget. We've received no notification, phone calls, briefings, or otherwise on this. And the 200th Airlift Squadron at Peterson provides secure, priority airlift for military and civilian leaders, which would have to be, I guess, farmed out to private vendors. Sensitive cargo airlift support for NORAD's critical Homeland Defense targeting mission, and all to save $482,000. And I'm convinced, Mr. Chairman, this is one of those cases where the military is making a penny-wise and pound-foolish decision. Because to save $482,000, you're going to lose 20 pilots, experienced pilots. And we have a huge pilot shortage in the Air Force and Guard, and to lose 20 of them for a very modest savings is, to me, penny-wise and pound-foolish. So I'm offering this amendment and asking support. Normally, I don't question the Pentagon on these kinds of decisions, but I think this is one that cries out for saying, wait a minute, go back and do something else, but don't do this. Because losing 20 pilots is just not a good decision. It's not that they're going somewhere else, they're just being lost. So I would ask support for this, and I would yield back.
Mr. Kaufman. The gentleman will hit his button, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support my colleague's amendment because the decision to divest of the 2 C-21A aircraft from the 200th Airlift Squadron from the Colorado National Guard is premature and not properly documented or justified. The Colorado Air National Guard's 200th Airlift Squadron provides secure priority airlifts for military and civilian leaders, supports sensitive cargo missions, and flies high-speed airborne target missions for the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. The proposed divestiture, despite the fact that Peterson Air Force Base is the second busiest distinguished visitor terminal in the Department of Defense, indicates to me that this decision was made out of a lack of appreciation for the true readiness issues we face in our military today. In particular, I oppose this action due to the simple fact that the Air Force has not followed its own strategic basing process for this crucial decision. The process is there to provide assurances that these basing decisions are not made, that are made in the best interest of national security of this country. And since this process was not followed, we know that we simply don't know that this was the correct decision. In addition to not following the Air Force's own strategic basing process for this decision, Congress was not provided with any official strategic level communication or justification. I'm truly dismayed by the lack of transparency. This year, this committee and my military personnel subcommittee heard from Air Force leadership about the acute pilot shortage it currently faces. We were told that it adds up to more than 1,500 pilots service-wide and includes more than 300 mobility pilots like those piloting the C-21s at Peterson Air Force Base. Shifting these aircraft out of a fully manned Air National Guard squadron to an active duty squadron when Mobility Air Command is short of pilots strikes me as an odd form and reverse logic. To me, the more logical approach and the most appropriate way for aircraft to flow is to move Air Mobility Command aircraft to fully manned reserve and guard units. Doing so would provide a way to begin digging ourselves out of this pilot shortage crisis by helping retain the pilots we do have. We should be supporting units like the 200th Airlift Squadron instead of divesting them and encouraging active service members as they leave active duty service to transition to the Guard and Reserve where we retain their experience. I urge my colleagues to support Representative Lamborn's amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I'll yield to myself in opposition to the amendment. I have tremendous respect for Mr. Lamborn and his oversight and advocacy for the military installations in his district. He does a great job. This is about moving 2 airplanes from Colorado Springs to Peterson Air Force Base. If this committee gets involved in every movement of 2 airplanes from one Air Force base to another, we will severely hamper the ability of the military to make decisions. Now, I will certainly support the gentleman's efforts to get more information and justification for this. The only other thing I would say is this is part of a bigger movement between the Air Force and the Air National Guard. Some things are coming into Colorado as things go out, and so there's all this shuffling going on. But I just don't think we can legislate 2 airplanes being moved. I think that is beyond what we should do, and therefore I oppose it. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I disagree completely and 100% with everything you just said. This is, again, an example of the committee micromanaging what the military is trying to do. And it does drive up the costs of what they're doing, to have to go through over and over and over again to justify all of their decisions. Now, every single member of this committee is going to have a decision that the Pentagon makes that we disagree with. About if we legislate on them, every single one, and as the chairman said, in the case of moving 2 aircraft, then we are going to tie the Pentagon up in knots when, as we all acknowledge, they got a lot more to do than have to fight over every single minor decision that they make in terms of how they move personnel or equipment. So I concur with the chairman's remarks and urge opposition to the amendment.
Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. As everyone knows, votes have been called. I think this is a good time for us to recess, go vote, gobble a sandwich, and be back promptly at the end of votes. The committee stands in recess.